There is a temple in Egypt where the last prayer was spoken over 1600 years ago. The priest who spoke it had no idea it would be the final time that God's name would ever be said in devotion. He performed the ritual as he had done countless times before, lighting the incense, whispering the ancient words, pressing his forehead against stone that had absorbed the prayers of thousands who came before him. Then he left. The doors closed, and in the centuries that followed, silence filled the spaces where hymns once echoed. Stand in one of these temples today, and you feel it immediately. Not the presence of the divine, but its absence. Your footsteps sound too loud in halls designed for processions of chanting priests. The stone is cold now, though once it knew the warmth of hands pressed in desperation, in gratitude, in fear. Statues stand with faces worn smooth by time and deliberate erasure, their features obliterated so thoroughly that we can only guess at the expressions they once wore. Altars remain where offerings were placed, food for gods who were believed to hunger, wine for gods who were thought to thirst. No incense has burned there for longer than most nations have existed. These spaces were not always abandoned, they were not always silent. There were decades, perhaps centuries, when fewer people came, when the old priests died and fewer young ones took their vows, when the rituals were performed with less conviction, more from habit than belief, when the words were still spoken, but no one quite remembered why. The temples emptied gradually, like water draining from a basin, so slowly you barely notice until one day it runs dry. This is not the story of one temple, one religion, one forgotten god. Walk through the ruins of Greece, and you find the same silence in the Parthenon, where Athena once received the devotion of an empire. Travel to the jungles of Central America and discover pyramids where gods demanded blood, where thousands gathered to witness sacrifice, where the calendar itself was organized around divine requirements. Now, tourist guides explain to confused visitors what these people believed, speaking of it in the past tense, as if discussing a curious historical footnote rather than a reality that shaped entire civilizations across every continent, in cultures that never met and never knew of each other's existence. The pattern repeats. Gods who commanded absolute devotion simply stopped existing, not in a moment of catastrophic revelation, not in a single battle between old and new. They faded like a candle burning through its last inch of wick, the light growing dimmer so gradually that each generation barely noticed the darkness increasing, until one day someone realized the flame was gone and had been for longer than anyone could remember. These were not abstract philosophical concepts. These were beings that billions of humans loved with the same intensity you might love a parent. They feared them as you might fear a storm. They structured their entire understanding of reality around them. Farmers planted according to their calendars, kings claimed authority through their blessing, mothers prayed to them over sick children, warriors called their names before battle. The gods were as real as the sun, as certain as death. And then they weren't. How does that happen? How do you forget something that complete, that fundamental, that woven into every moment of existence? How do gods die? Not the violent death of battle, but the quiet death of abandonment. A death so gradual that no one marks the moment, no one remembers the last believer. No one knows when faith became folklore and folklore became nothing at all. And perhaps more disturbing, if the most powerful gods in human history could be forgotten so completely, could it happen again to the gods worshipped today? To understand how gods die, we must first understand how completely they once lived. In ancient Rome, there were more gods than there were days in the year. Every doorway had a god watching who entered and who left. Every river had a god whose moods determined whether you could cross safely. Every moment of your life, from the instant of birth to the final breath of death, was supervised by beings who could reward you with fortune or curse you with plague. The question we struggle with today is not why people believed in so many gods, but how anyone could possibly forget something that complete. Imagine waking in a world where the supernatural was not a question of faith, but a simple fact of existence. A farmer in ancient Mesopotamia did not plant seeds and hope for the best. He negotiated with Tammuz, the god of vegetation, making offerings and speaking prayers because the harvest depended not on weather patterns he could not understand, but on a divine being who could be pleased or angered. If the crops failed, it was not bad luck, it was a message. The god was displeased, and you needed to discover why. A sailor in Greece preparing to leave port did not simply check his vessel and study the stars. He prayed to Poseidon, asking the god to calm specific waves, to hold back specific storms. When he returned safely, he made offerings of gratitude not to fortune or chance, but to a being with a name, a personality, a known history of helping or destroying sailors based on whether they showed proper respect. The gods were not abstract forces. They had preferences, grudges, favorite mortals, and enemies they punished across generations. Walk into a Roman household at dawn, and you would witness the family gathered before a small shrine, making offerings to the lares, the household gods who protected the family's well-being. These were not optional rituals performed by the especially devout. They were as routine as eating breakfast, as necessary as locking the door. To neglect the lares was to invite disaster, as certainly as leaving a fire unattended. In Egypt, priests performed elaborate ceremonies each morning for statues of gods housed in temple sanctuaries. They washed the statues, applied cosmetics, dressed them in fresh clothing, and offered them food and drink. This was not symbolic. The statues were not representations of the gods. They were the gods physically present, requiring care and attention. Priests approached this work with the seriousness of caring for living royalty, because that is precisely what they believed they were doing. In the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, thousands gathered to watch prisoners of war sacrificed atop pyramids, their hearts cut from their chests while still beating. This was not cruelty for its own sake. The gods demanded it. Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, required human blood to maintain his strength for the daily battle against darkness. Without these sacrifices, the sun might fail to rise. The universe itself depended on humanity fulfilling its obligations to the divine. Laws were not created by councils of wise men debating justice. They were divine commands delivered through priests and prophets. Kings did not rule by political skill alone. They were gods themselves, or chosen representatives of gods, their authority flowing from heaven rather than earth. Wars were not fought over resources or territory, but because gods demanded conquest, because rival gods needed to be proven inferior, because the divine order required it. Natural disasters carried clear meaning. Earthquakes meant the gods were angry. Floods were punishment for collective sin. Drought was abandonment, the gods withdrawing their favor until humanity corrected whatever offense had been committed. Every unexplained death, every illness, every stroke of fortune or misfortune pointed back to divine action. The relationship was reciprocal and absolute. Gods needed worship to maintain their existence and power. Humans needed gods to make sense of a chaotic, terrifying world where death came without warning and suffering had no apparent pattern. But if the gods were so deeply embedded in every fiber of civilization, what force could possibly be powerful enough to erase them? The answer is more complex and more human than you might think. Here is what they do not teach in history class. The fall of ancient gods follows a script, and if you know the script, you can predict which gods might be next. The pattern repeats across continents, across centuries in civilizations that never knew the others existed. The Greeks had no contact with the Maya. The Egyptians never met the Norse, yet their gods died in remarkably similar ways, moving through stages so consistent that once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Stage 1 arrives quietly, the gods become distant. Temples are still maintained, but priests notice fewer visitors. The great festivals still happen, but the crowds are smaller. Families still make offerings, but perhaps once a month rather than daily. No one announces they have stopped believing. They simply attend less frequently. They forget the specific prayers their grandparents knew by heart. The rituals continue, but something essential has leaked out of them, the sense of urgent necessity, the feeling that divine presence fills these spaces. Stage 2 follows naturally. Syncretism begins. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, Greek and Egyptian gods started blending together. Ammon became Zeus, Ammon. Serapis emerged as a fusion of Osiris and Greek deities, designed to appeal to both populations. This seems like adaptation, like religions finding common ground, but it dilutes. When gods merge, they lose their unique identities. The specific prayers stop working because no one is quite sure anymore which version of the god they are addressing. The sharp edges blur. Stage 3 happens among the educated first, then spreads. The gods become metaphorical. Sophisticated Roman citizens begin speaking of Jupiter as a symbol of authority rather than an actual being hurling lightning bolts. Greek philosophers reinterpret Athena as the principle of wisdom rather than a goddess with a personality. This feels enlightened, like intellectual progress. But once gods become symbols, they lose their power to demand anything. You cannot fear a metaphor. You cannot love an abstraction. The gods become ideas you discuss rather than beings you serve. Stage 4 brings political change. A new dynasty takes power and favors different gods. Constantine converts the Roman Empire to Christianity. The Aztec gods fall when Spanish conquistadors impose Catholicism. Sometimes this happens through violence, temples destroyed and priests killed, but more often it happens through administrative change. New rulers stop funding old temples. They redirect resources to new religions. The infrastructure that sustained the old gods, the priesthoods, the festivals, the daily rituals, simply runs out of money and personnel. Stage 5 is the saddest. The final generation. The last believers die without successfully passing their faith to their children. Perhaps the children were educated in new schools that taught different truths. Perhaps they moved to cities where the old gods had no temples. Perhaps they simply found the old beliefs irrelevant to their lives. The elderly remember, but when they die, the memory dies with them. No catastrophic ending marks this moment, just silence where prayer used to be. The pattern reveals something disturbing. Gods do not die only from external attack. They die from internal collapse. When people stop needing the explanations gods provide, when science explains thunder and drought and disease, when secular law replaces divine justice, when kings claim authority without divine mandate, the gods lose their function. And beings whose only existence depends on human belief and worship cannot survive functional obsolescence. This happened to the gods of Egypt, Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, the Norse lands, the Americas. Dozens of pantheons, thousands of deities, billions of believers, all following the same script toward the same ending. If there is a pattern, it means the phenomenon is not finished. It means the script is still running. The pattern exists. But to truly understand it, we need to watch it unfold in real time. Let us travel to Egypt, to the moment when the most powerful gods in human history began their long, slow descent into silence. For 3,000 years, the Egyptian gods were the most powerful in human history. Ra crossed the sky every single day without fail. Osiris judged every soul. Mat maintained cosmic balance, until one day they did not. What happened in the temples when the gods stopped answering? To understand the silence that would eventually come, you must first understand. Dawn in ancient Thebes during the New Kingdom brought a symphony of devotion. As the first light touched the Nile, hundreds of shaved, headed priests in white linen moved through the massive temple complex at Karnak, their footsteps whispering against stone floors that had known this same ritual for generations. They carried offerings toward the sanctuary at the temple's heart, where the god waited in darkness. The morning ritual was not symbolic, it was essential. Inside the innermost chamber, a statue of Ammon, rare, stood 3 times the height of a man, covered in gold that would catch the torchlight and seem to breathe. The high priest approached alone, speaking the words that had been spoken every morning since the temple was built. He broke the clay seal on the sanctuary doors, a seal placed fresh each night to prove no human hand had disturbed the god's rest. He opened the doors. He approached the statue and performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, ritually awakening the god so it could eat and drink the offerings brought before it. This was not theatre for an audience. This happened in darkness, witnessed only by the highest priests, because the god was actually present in that statue, actually required this care, actually consumed the spiritual essence of the bread and beer and meat laid before it. To modern minds, this seems like elaborate pretend. To the Egyptians, it was as real and necessary as feeding your children. The scale of this devotion defies easy comprehension. Karnak was not a single temple, but a complex covering more than 200 acres with massive pylons, towering obelisks, and forests of columns carved with hieroglyphs recounting the god's deeds. Luxor Temple connected to it by an avenue lined with sphinx statues. On festival days, the god's statue was placed on a golden boat and carried through the streets by priests while crowds pressed close, desperate for even a glimpse of the divine presence passing by. Frankincense burned constantly in the temple darkness, its smoke carrying prayers upward. The smell was everywhere, mixed with the scent of oils used to anoint the statues and the faint copper tang of animal blood from sacrifices. Chanting echoed through stone corridors at precise hours, the priests' voices rising and falling in patterns that had been perfected across centuries. This was not primitive superstition. This was sophisticated theology. Ra was not merely the sun. He was order itself, the principle that kept chaos at bay, the embodiment of kingship and the daily victory over darkness. Each night, Ra travelled through the underworld, battling the serpent Apophis, who sought to devour him and end existence. Each dawn proved Ra victorious again, and the priest's rituals had helped him win that battle. Without the rituals, the sun might not rise. Osiris was not merely the god of death. He was resurrection, the promise that death was not an ending but a transition. He was the flooding of the Nile that brought life to the fields. He was the guarantee that the universe operated on principles of justice, that good was rewarded and evil punished, that there was meaning to suffering. When a person died, they would stand before Osiris and his 42 divine judges, their heart weighed against the feather of Marat to determine their worthiness for eternal life. The pharaoh himself was a living god, Horus incarnate, the direct link between heaven and earth. When the pharaoh spoke, a god spoke. When the pharaoh commanded, divine will manifested. The entire civilization was organized as a bridge between the mortal and eternal, with the gods not distant and remote, but intimately involved in every harvest, every birth, every decision of state. Even death was not separate from divine oversight. The elaborate mummification, the tomb paintings, the Book of the Dead placed with the deceased, all of this prepared the dead for their journey through the afterlife and their judgment before the gods. Death was simply passing from one divine realm to another, but at the height of this divine power, a crack appeared, and it came from the most unexpected place, from a pharaoh who thought he could do what no mortal had ever done. Choose which gods would exist. One man almost killed all the gods of Egypt. He came within a generation of succeeding, and when he died, the priests were so terrified of what he had done that they erased his name from history. But the question he raised could not be erased. Can a god die if enough people stop believing? Around 1353 BCE, a pharaoh took the throne who would attempt something no one had dared before. His birth name was Amenhotep, meaning Ammon is satisfied. Within years he would change it to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and declare that every god Egypt had worshipped for thousands of years was false. There was only one true god, the Aten, represented by the disk of the sun, and Akhenaten himself was the sole intermediary between humanity and this singular divine force. The temples of Amun-Ra were closed, not quietly, not gradually, but by royal decree. The priesthoods that had maintained daily rituals for generations were disbanded, their lands were confiscated, their power was stripped away overnight. Across Egypt, workers were sent to monuments to chisel away the names of the old gods, particularly Ammon, erasing them from inscriptions that had stood for centuries. It was not enough to stop worship. The names themselves had to be destroyed, as if by removing the written word, the gods could be unmade. Akhenaten built a new capital city in the desert, a place untouched by the old gods. He called it Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten. It rose impossibly fast, a city of temples and palaces dedicated entirely to the one god he recognized. The temples had no dark inner sanctuaries. They were open to the sky because the Aten was visible, present in the sunlight itself, requiring no hidden mysteries or elaborate rituals. Just the pharaoh, the sun, and a new order that rejected everything that had come before. This was perhaps the first recorded attempt at enforced monotheism in human history, and it reveals something crucial about how gods exist. They require more than abstract belief. They require infrastructure. They require priests performing daily rituals. They require temples where people can bring their prayers. They require festivals, hymns, stories passed from parent to child. Without these things, without the institutional framework that sustains them, even ancient gods begin to fade from human consciousness. The old priesthoods resisted, but quietly. They had lost their official positions, but they remembered. Common people continued worshipping the old gods in secret in their homes, in small shrines hidden from the pharaoh's inspectors. The bureaucracy that had run efficiently for centuries began to fracture. Foreign territories sensed weakness in Egypt's leadership and began to slip away. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence from this period discovered millennia later, show vassal states pleading for help that never came, because Akhenaten was focused on his religious revolution, while the empire crumbled at its edges. The experiment lasted barely more than a decade. When Akhenaten died, his successor was a boy who had been born Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten. Within a few years, the boy's name was changed to Tutankhamen, living image of Amun. The old gods were restored. The priests returned to the temples. The daily rituals resumed. Akhenaten was abandoned, left to the desert that would eventually bury it so completely that its location was lost for 3,000 years. The priests went further. They erased Akhenaten's name from king lists, chiseling it from monuments as he had chiseled away the names of the old gods. They called him the criminal or the rebel in the few places they had to reference his reign at all. They wanted him forgotten, erased from history as completely as he had tried to erase Amun. But the damage was done in ways they could not undo. The experiment had proved something terrifying. Gods could be challenged. Divine order was not as permanent as everyone had believed. If one pharaoh with enough power could nearly erase thousands of years of religion in just a few decades, what did that reveal about the true nature of the gods? Were they dependent on human belief rather than the other way around? If worship could be turned on and off by royal decree, were the gods ever really there? Akhenaten's revolution was reversed, but he had opened a door that could never be fully closed. The old gods returned, but they returned to a different Egypt. An Egypt that had learned gods could be vulnerable. There is a wall in Egypt where a Christian carved a cross over the face of Ra. It is still there today. Look at it closely, and you can see both images, the god and the symbol that replaced him, frozen in stone at the exact moment of transition. That moment lasted 300 years. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, the temples remained open. The daily rituals continued. The priests still performed the opening of the mouth ceremony each dawn, but something fundamental had shifted. Egypt was no longer ruled by pharaohs who were themselves gods. It was ruled by Greek kings who respected Egyptian religion, the way a tourist respects local customs, with polite interest but no deep conviction. The Ptolemaic dynasty that followed Alexander did not destroy Egyptian religion, they transformed it. They created Serapis, a new god designed to appeal to both Greeks and Egyptians, a fusion of Osiris and Greek deities like Zeus and Hades. Serapis had a Greek name, Greek artistic styling, but claimed Egyptian antiquity. This seemed like religious tolerance, like cultures finding common ground, but fusion dilutes. When you merge gods, neither survives intact. Serapis was popular, but he was not quite Osiris and not quite Zeus. He was something new, and in being new, he proved that the old gods were not as unchangeable as their followers had believed. The temples continued functioning, but the priesthoods shrank. Fewer families sent their sons to train in the ancient rituals. The knowledge that had been passed down for millennia began to concentrate in fewer and fewer hands. Conservative traditionalists maintained the old ways, but they were aging, and the young were learning Greek, speaking Greek, thinking in Greek categories that did not quite match the Egyptian understanding of divinity. When Rome absorbed Egypt, the transformation accelerated. Egyptian gods became exotic curiosities. Isis was worshipped in Rome itself, but as a mystery cult deity, stripped of her complex Egyptian context. She became the goddess you turned to for personal salvation, for secret knowledge, for spiritual experiences the cold Roman state religion could not provide. This was not the Isis who was sister, wife of Osiris, who searched for his scattered body, who embodied the throne of Egypt itself. This was a version of Isis shaped by Roman expectations, reshaped until she was barely recognizable to the priests in Egypt who still remembered the original. The temples kept functioning, maintained now by a small dedicated priesthood and by traditionalists who saw themselves as preserving a sacred trust against the erosions of time. Hieroglyphs were still carved, hymns were still sung, but each generation knew less than the one before. Then Christianity arrived, and what had been gradual became sudden. In 391 and 392 CE, Emperor Theodosius I issued decrees outlawing pagan worship throughout the Roman Empire. The reading of these decrees in Alexandria was not abstract policy. Christian mobs attacked the Serapeum, the great temple of Serapis, that syncretic god who had represented the last attempt at religious fusion. They tore down the statue, they burned the library, they converted the temple complex into a church. Across Egypt, the pattern repeated. Temples were closed by imperial order. Priests were given a choice: convert to Christianity or lose everything. Many converted. Some held out, maintaining secret rituals, teaching their children the old prayers in whispers. But you cannot maintain a religion in whispers. You cannot pass down complex theological systems through furtive meetings and hidden shrines. The last functioning Egyptian temple was at Philae, on an island in the Nile near the southern border. It survived until 537 CE, maintained by Nubian worshippers who had negotiated special permission to continue their traditional practices. The priests there were the last people on earth who could read hieroglyphs fluently, who knew the full rituals, who understood what the symbols actually meant. When that temple finally closed, when those last priests died, the language of the gods died with them. There were people alive who remembered when the temples were full, who had been children during the last great festivals, who could still recite hymns but had no one left to sing them to. The temples were converted to churches. Hieroglyphs were chiseled away to make room for crosses. Priests either converted or died without successors. Each generation knew less until even the language was forgotten. Egypt's gods had reigned for 3 millennia, but they fell if the most powerful, most ancient gods in human history could be forgotten. What chance did the others have? Let us turn to Greece, where the gods on Mount Olympus were about to face their own impossible ending. The Greeks did not just worship their gods, they argued with them, bargained with them, sometimes even insulted them. The gods were family members you could not escape, which makes what happened next even stranger. The Greeks killed their gods by thinking too much. Greek religion was not about distant, unknowable forces. It was intimate, immediate, almost uncomfortably personal. Zeus was not an abstract concept of sky and authority. He was a being with preferences and grudges, with favorite mortals and enemies he pursued across generations. He seduced women, punished those who offended him, and occasionally made catastrophically poor decisions. Hera was jealous and vengeful. Ares was bloodthirsty and cowardly. Aphrodite caused chaos for her own amusement. These were not metaphors. To the Greeks, these were actual beings with personalities as distinct as any humans. At Delphi, people travelled from across the Mediterranean to consult the oracle, the Pythia, a priestess who sat above a chasm in Apollo's temple and delivered prophecies while in a trance state. Leaders planning wars, individuals facing impossible decisions, cities resolving disputes, all came seeking Apollo's guidance. The prophecies were famously ambiguous, but that ambiguity was itself proof of divine wisdom. The god spoke, and if you misunderstood, that was your failure, not his. Every 4 years, athletes gathered at Olympia for games held in Zeus's honor. This was not merely sporting competition, it was sacred ritual. Winners were crowned with olive wreaths and understood themselves to have been favored by the god. To cheat at the games was not just breaking rules. It was offending Zeus himself, and stone columns were erected inscribed with the names of cheaters as eternal monuments to their impiety. At Eleusis, initiates into the mysteries of Demeter experienced something so profound that they were forbidden under pain of death to speak of what they witnessed. We still do not know exactly what happened in those ceremonies, but ancient sources describe initiates emerging transformed, no longer fearing death, convinced they had encountered the divine directly. Whatever they experienced, it was real enough to change lives. Greeks experienced their gods constantly. When lightning split the sky, Zeus had spoken. When the harvest failed, Demeter was withholding her blessing. When you fell suddenly, inexplicably in love, Aphrodite had pierced you with one of her arrows. Dreams were not random firings of the sleeping brain. They were messages from gods requiring interpretation and response. Omens appeared everywhere, in the flight of birds, in the organs of sacrificed animals, in unexpected meetings and coincidental events. In every home stood a small shrine where the family made daily offerings to the household gods and the spirits of ancestors. These were not optional practices for the especially devout. They were as routine as meals, as necessary as maintaining the house itself. The gods were not distant. They were present in the walls, in the hearth, in the threshold you crossed entering and leaving. Public religion was equally integrated into civic life. Sacrifices at city temples were community events where animals were ritually slaughtered and the meat distributed among citizens. The smell of roasting flesh mixed with incense was the smell of piety, of community, of being Greek. Festivals honoring Dionysus included theatrical performances that were not entertainment as we understand it. They were religious ritual, reenacting divine stories, teaching moral lessons, honoring the god who gave humanity wine and ecstasy. Political identity and religious identity were inseparable. Athens was not just protected by Athena, it was her city, born from her gift of the olive tree in her competition with Poseidon for the city's patronage. To be Athenian meant being in relationship with Athena. The Parthenon was not a museum, but a functioning temple housing a 40-foot-tall gold and ivory statue of the goddess. Citizens gathered there not to admire architecture, but to honor their patron, their protector, the divine being who had chosen them. The gods were everywhere, in everything, intimate and demanding and undeniable. But as Greek civilization matured, something unprecedented happened. Philosophers began asking dangerous questions. What if the gods were not actually divine? What if they were just powerful beings, or worse? What if they were simply useful stories? Socrates was sentenced to death for asking one question. What if the gods are not good simply because they are gods, but gods are gods because they are good? That question killed Mount Olympus more surely than any Christian ever could. Because once you start questioning the gods, they stop answering. The trouble began centuries before Socrates, with men who looked at the world and refused to accept divine explanations. Thales of Miletus in the 6th century BCE proposed that water was the fundamental substance from which everything arose. Not Oceanus, the Titan, not Poseidon's domain, just water, behaving according to principles that could be understood through observation and reason. Anaximander suggested the boundless, an undefined eternal substance that required no divine creator. Democritus described atoms and void, tiny particles moving through empty space, according to natural laws, with no need for gods to push them along their paths. These were not attacks on religion. They were simply alternative explanations. But alternatives are dangerous to beings whose existence depends on being the only explanation available. When thunder could be understood as atmospheric phenomenon rather than Zeus' anger, when earthquakes could be explained by the movements of the earth rather than Poseidon's displeasure, the gods began losing their grip on human imagination. Xenophanes went further. He mocked the way humans created gods in their own image, pointing out that if horses had gods, those gods would look like horses. Ethiopians, he noted, depicted their gods with dark skin. Thracians gave their gods red hair and blue eyes. Was it not obvious that humans were simply projecting their own characteristics onto cosmic forces they did not understand? The observation seems simple, almost childish, but it introduced a critical distance, a space between the believer and the believed where doubt could grow. The sophists made the gap wider. They taught that moral laws were not divine commands carved into the fabric of reality, but human constructs, useful fictions that societies created to maintain order. What was just in Athens might be unjust in Sparta. What the gods supposedly demanded in one city, they supposedly forbade in another. Did this not suggest that the gods' commands were simply reflections of human custom dressed in divine authority? Traditionalists recognized the danger. When Socrates was brought to trial in 399 BCE, the charges were clear: not believing in the city, Thes gods, and corrupting the youth. He was not accused of being an atheist in the modern sense. The accusation was more specific and more troubling. He was asking questions that made the gods seem contingent rather than necessary, that suggested divine authority might rest on something more fundamental than the gods themselves. He was teaching young men to think critically about beliefs their fathers had accepted without question. The jury voted for death, but the questions remained, and they spread. Plato transformed the gods into shadows of higher truths. The real divinity was not Zeus, but the form of the good, an abstract principle of perfection that existed beyond the material world. The Olympian gods were at best imperfect reflections of this higher reality, and at worst, they were simply powerful beings who deserved no worship at all. Aristotle took a different path, describing the unmoved mover, a principle of pure thought thinking itself, indifferent to human affairs, causing motion not through action but through being desired. This was philosophically sophisticated, but it was spiritually cold. You cannot pray to an abstraction. You cannot love a principle. A social division opened like a wound. Educated elites increasingly viewed traditional religion as useful fiction, necessary for controlling the masses, but not literally true. Yet they continued participating in public rituals, making sacrifices, attending festivals, not from belief but from civic duty, from social obligation, from the understanding that religion served important functions even if its claims were false. When the intellectuals of a civilization stop believing while continuing to perform the rituals, the religion becomes hollow. It becomes a shell maintained by habit rather than conviction, and shells are fragile. Common people sensed this hollowness even if they could not articulate it. In the Hellenistic period, mystery cults from the East gained popularity. Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, eventually Christ from Judea. People were searching for spiritual experiences, for gods who demanded genuine devotion rather than civic performance, for religions that offered transformation rather than tradition. The philosophers had planted seeds of doubt, but the Olympians might have survived doubt. What they could not survive was competition, the arrival of a god who offered something Zeus never could: salvation. The last Olympic Games honoring Zeus were held in 393 CE. The athletes competed in the shadow of the god, 40-foot, tall gold and ivory statue. 4 years later, the games were banned as pagan worship. Today, that statue does not exist anywhere in the world. How do you erase a wonder of the ancient world? Christianity spread first among Greek-speaking populations, which created a strange irony. The philosophy that had weakened the Olympians, Plato's emphasis on higher truths beyond material reality, the search for ultimate principles, the suspicion of anthropomorphic gods, had prepared the intellectual soil for monotheism. When Christian preachers arrived speaking of one transcendent God beyond all material representation, educated Greeks found the concept philosophically familiar, even if the specific claims were radical. The competition was not equal. Zeus offered civic identity and traditional authority, but no personal relationship, no promise of individual salvation. If you were wealthy enough to make proper sacrifices, if your city prospered, perhaps the gods smiled on you. But Zeus did not love you. He did not know your name. He did not promise that your suffering had meaning or that death was not the end. Christ offered all of this, a God who knew you individually, who suffered alongside you, who promised resurrection and eternal life, not based on social status but on faith and grace. Traditional priests performed rituals by rote, maintaining ceremonies whose original meanings had been half forgotten. Christian preachers told compelling stories of redemption, of fishermen becoming apostles, of prostitutes forgiven, of the last becoming first. They offered a narrative where your current circumstances did not define your spiritual worth. the social dimension proved equally powerful. Traditional temple worship was for citizens, for men of property, for those with standing in the community. Christianity attracted the urban poor, women who found unprecedented roles in early Christian communities, slaves who were told they were equal before God. These were populations who found little place in the cold marble temples, where priests performed sacrifices to distant gods who seemed to care only for the powerful. For centuries, both traditions coexisted uneasily. Then came Theodosius I. Between 391 and 392 CE, he issued decrees outlawing pagan worship throughout the Roman Empire. Temples were ordered closed, public sacrifice was banned, priesthoods were disbanded. What had been the official religion of the greatest empire in history became illegal overnight. In 393 CE, the Olympic Games were held at Olympia, at Zeus' own sanctuary, for the final time. Athletes competed as they had for nearly 1,200 years. The stadium held thousands of spectators. The sacred olive grove rustled in the same winds that had rustled it when the games began in 776 BCE. The statue of Zeus presided as it had always presided, the god of gods, king of Olympus, fashioned by the sculptor Phidias from gold and ivory, his throne decorated with precious stones, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The athletes did not know they were participating in an ending. They competed, they were crowned with olive wreaths, they returned home honored. 4 years later, when the next games should have been held, they were not. Theodosius had banned them as pagan ritual. The statue of Zeus was eventually taken to Constantinople, where it was destroyed in a fire. The date is uncertain, the circumstances unclear. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world simply ceased to exist, broken apart and burned, reduced to ash and melted metal. The temples at Olympia fell into ruin. Earthquakes toppled what humans had not already demolished. The stadium filled with dirt. The olive grove was cut down. Within just a few generations, the Greek language itself changed. Words for specific temple rituals, for types of sacrifices, for the relationships between gods and mortals became archaic. Then they became unintelligible. Then they were lost completely, preserved only in ancient texts that later generations would read as mythology rather than lived religion. The gods of Egypt fell, the gods of Greece fell, but surely the gods who ruled the mightiest empire in history, Rome itself, surely Jupiter and his pantheon were different. They were not. They fell too, but in the most Roman way possible. They were assimilated until they ceased to exist. Long before Zeus, before Ra, before any god you have heard of, there was Marduk. He defeated the dragon of chaos and built the world from her corpse. For 3,000 years, every Babylonian king swore allegiance to him. His temple was the literal center of the universe. Today, most people have never heard his name. How does a god that ancient, that fundamental, simply vanish? The story begins in Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where humanity first learned to build cities, to write, to organize itself into something recognizable as civilization. Around 4000 BCE, the Sumerians raised the first temples, massive stepped pyramids called ziggurats that rose from the flat plains like artificial mountains. These were not places where people gathered to worship. They were the literal houses of the gods, dwelling places where divine beings resided and required service. The priest, kings who ruled these early cities managed both divine and earthly affairs because there was no distinction between the two. The temple was the economic center, the political center, the spiritual center. Everything flowed through it. The gods were not distant cosmic forces. They were present, demanding, requiring daily care like the most exacting of masters. The theology was sophisticated in ways that modern minds struggle to appreciate. An, the Sky Father, ruled over all. Enlil controlled wind and authority, the force that separated heaven from earth. Enki embodied wisdom and fresh water, the intelligence that made civilization possible. Inanna, later called Ishtar, was both love and war, not because these seem connected to us, but because the Mesopotamians understood that desire and violence spring from the same fierce intensity. and Marduk, who would rise to supremacy in Babylon, was the god who fought the dragon Tiamat, the embodiment of chaos, and from her corpse created the ordered world. Daily life was saturated with divine presence. Merchants pressed cylinder seals into clay tablets, invoking gods to witness and protect their transactions. Priests practiced extispacy, reading the future in the organs of sacrificed animals, interpreting the shape of the liver as a message written in flesh by divine hands. Kings performed the sacred marriage ritual, ceremonially uniting with the goddess to ensure the land's fertility, because the prosperity of the harvest depended not on agriculture alone, but on the divine sexual union being properly enacted. Humans knew their place in this order. The creation myths were explicit. The gods had grown tired of laboring to maintain the world, so they created humans as servants to perform that work. The entire civilization was organized as one massive temple household. You farmed to feed the gods. You built to house the gods. You existed to serve beings who required service to continue sustaining reality itself. These were not just the first gods of civilization, they were the prototype. The flood myths that would appear in the Epic of Gilgamesh would echo in the story of Noah. The creation narratives would influence Genesis. The divine hierarchies, the concept of a supreme god ruling lesser deities, the idea that humans were created for divine purposes. All of this began here in the mud, brick cities of ancient Sumer and Babylon. When these gods faded, they took with them not just religious practices, but millennia of accumulated theological sophistication, knowledge so old and deep that later civilizations would build on its foundations without remembering where those foundations came from. The irony cuts deep. These gods predated all others. They seemed eternal, fundamental, as permanent as the rivers that gave the land life. Yet they would be among the most completely forgotten. For over 2,000 years after their final worshippers died, no one could read their names. No one remembered their stories. The gods who came first vanished most completely, but Marduk's reign over Mesopotamia was not eternal. His greatest battle was not with dragons or demons, it was with time itself, and with new gods who claimed they alone were real. In 75 CE, roughly the same time the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, priests in Babylon were still writing prayers to Marduk in a language no one else alive could read. They were the last people on earth who remembered the gods that predated all other gods. When they died, they took 3,000 years of divine knowledge with them into silence. The death of Mesopotamian religion was not quick. It was so slow that no single generation would have recognized it was dying. The process began around 900 BCE when the Assyrian Empire consolidated power across the region. Conquest spread the religion but also diluted it. Local city gods were subordinated to imperial deities. Marduk of Babylon, Ashur of Assyria. These became supreme, while older gods faded to supporting roles. When you create hierarchies among gods, you teach people that some divine beings matter more than others. And if some gods can be less important, perhaps none are truly essential. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon. He did not destroy the temples or ban the worship. Instead, he did something more subtle and more devastating. He claimed that Marduk himself had chosen him to rule, that the god had looked upon the failures of Babylon's last king and selected a foreigner to restore proper order. The priests, faced with foreign occupation, accepted this narrative because the alternative was admitting their god had been defeated. But once you establish that your god can choose foreign conquerors, you have made that god a tool of political convenience rather than an absolute truth. Alexander arrived in 331 BCE, and the blending accelerated. Greeks identified Marduk with Zeus, Ishtar with Aphrodite, trying to make sense of Babylonian religion through Greek categories. But the identification never fit comfortably. Marduk was not Zeus. The stories were different, the attributes did not align, the theological frameworks operated on different assumptions. The Greeks treated Babylonian religion with the polite respect tourists show local customs. Interesting, exotic, worth learning about, but not quite real in the way their own gods were real. And yet the temples continued functioning. This is the remarkable part. Babylonian priests maintained their traditions for centuries after their civilization lost political independence. They continued astronomical observations, recording the movements of planets with extraordinary precision. They continued writing in cuneiform, that wedge-shaped script pressed into clay tablets. Even as fewer people learned to read it, they continued performing rituals whose origins stretched back thousands of years, maintaining institutional momentum long after the driving force had dissipated. The temple at Uruk, one of humanity's oldest cities, had scribes recording astronomical observations in cuneiform as late as 75 CE. This was more than 600 years after Alexander's conquest. Think about what that means. These priests were maintaining a tradition older than most modern nations have existed, writing in a script no one else alive could read, worshipping gods no one else remembered, performing rituals whose purpose they themselves only partly understood. What must that have felt like? Knowing you were among the last who remembered, watching your tradition fade not through persecution, but through irrelevance. Young people stopped learning the sacred languages. Families stopped sending their sons to become priests. The old ways continued because that is what had always been done, but each generation knew less than the one before. Unlike Egyptian religion or Greek paganism, which faced direct Christian opposition, Mesopotamian religion simply faded from disuse. There was no dramatic final battle, no martyred priests, no mass conversions. People gradually stopped speaking Akkadian, stopped learning cuneiform, stopped understanding what the rituals meant. The priests themselves eventually forgot why they performed certain rites, maintaining forms whose contents had been lost. The forgetting was so complete that when archaeologists began excavating Mesopotamian sites in the 1800 civilization, the world had entirely lost. Cuneiform was not deciphered until the 1850s. Until then, Marduk and his kind existed only in fragmentary biblical references, interpreted as legend rather than history. The Mesopotamian gods vanished so completely that for over 1500 years, no one even knew they had existed. But at least they had that small mercy. They were forgotten, not actively destroyed. The next gods we will meet were not so fortunate. We have translated thousands of cuneiform tablets about Mesopotamian gods. We know their names, their attributes, their relationships. But here is what we do not know and can never know: what it actually felt like to believe in them. The emotional experience, the sense of presence, the spiritual reality, that died with the last believer, and no archaeology can bring it back. We have recovered the words but lost the faith. The challenge is more profound than most people realize. Yes, scholars have deciphered cuneiform. Yes, we can read ritual texts describing elaborate ceremonies performed in temple courtyards. But we do not know the music that accompanied them. We do not know the emotional experience of participants. We do not know which parts were considered central and which were peripheral formalities. We have the script of a play without the performance, the recipe without the taste, the map without the territory. Scholars debate fundamental questions about Mesopotamian belief. Did they view their gods as literal beings with personalities and physical presence, as cosmic principles given narrative form for easier comprehension, as psychological projections of human needs and fears, as some combination of all these that our modern categories cannot capture? The texts do not clearly answer, because the texts were written for people who already understood, who lived within the system and needed no explanations of basic assumptions. Take the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest stories. We have it. We can read it. We can analyze its themes of mortality, friendship, the search for meaning. But we do not know what it meant to the people who first heard it. Was it theology? A cautionary tale about the limits of human ambition, entertainment, royal propaganda? Something that does not fit into any modern category. We impose our interpretations on ancient texts, reading them through frameworks the original authors and audiences would not recognize. The Enuma Elish describes Marduk's defeat of Tiamat and the creation of the world from her corpse. Is this cosmology? Political allegory legitimizing Babylon's supremacy? Ritual recitation meant to reactualize creation annually? All of these, none of these in the way we understand them. The text exists, but the context that gave it meaning is gone. If we cannot fully understand what people 3,000 years ago actually believed about their gods, if the experiential and emotional core of their faith is forever inaccessible, then in what sense do we know these religions at all? We have rediscovered the skeleton of a belief system. We can describe its structure, map its major deities, catalogue its rituals. But the living tissue of faith has decomposed beyond recovery. We know what they did. We can only guess at what it meant to them. The implication extends beyond Mesopotamia. Perhaps every religious tradition, no matter how carefully documented, will eventually become similarly opaque to future generations. The texts will survive. The buildings will crumble but leave archaeological traces. But the subjective experience, the sense of the sacred, the emotional reality of belief, these exist only in living practitioners. When they die, that dimension dies with them. Scholars race against time. The Digital Cuneiform Library Initiative scans thousands of tablets, creating high-resolution images before the clay crumbles. Teams work to translate texts that have sat unread in museum storage for over a century. They are preserving what can be preserved, documenting what can be documented. But they know they are recording something already dead, creating archives of belief systems no one believes. There is an ironic parallel. The last Babylonian priests carefully maintained their temple libraries, copying old tablets, recording observations, preserving knowledge they believed would matter forever. They did not know they would be the last to read these texts with understanding. Now, modern scholars carefully digitize those same tablets, preserving them for a future they hope will care, not knowing whether future generations will find these archives meaningful or merely curious. This is not just an academic problem. It is about whether meaning can survive the death of its native speakers and practitioners, whether faith, once extinguished, can ever be truly rekindled. If the gods of the ancient Near East are now mysterious to us, at least they left written records, tablets, and temples. The next gods we will explore left almost nothing, and yet they may have burned brighter and died more violently than any others. It is time to travel north, to the frozen lands where the gods predicted their own destruction. The Norse gods knew they were going to die. Their apocalypse was written into their scripture. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when even mighty Odin would fall. But when the real end came, it was not wolves and giants and cosmic serpents. It was something far more mundane, missionaries with books, kings seeking political legitimacy, and the slow bureaucratic conversion of a people who had never had churches or written scripture. Ragnarok came, just not the way the prophecy said it would. The Norse cosmos was a place of 9 worlds connected by Yggdrasil, the world tree whose roots reached into different realms and whose branches held up the sky. Gods lived in Asgard, humans in Midgard, giants in Jotunheim, and the dead in Hell, or if they were chosen, in Odin's Hall of Valhalla. This was not metaphor. To the Norse, these were actual places, as real as the fjords and forests they could see, simply located in dimensions their eyes could not reach. The gods themselves were warriors. Odin, the All-Father, had sacrificed one of his eyes to drink from the well of wisdom. He had hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, to gain knowledge of the runes. Thor battled giants and monsters, protecting both gods and humans from forces of chaos. The Valkyries, Odin's warrior maidens, flew over battlefields, selecting which slain warriors were worthy to join the Einherjar in Valhalla, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok came. Word was the Norse concept of fate, and it was inescapable. Destiny could not be avoided, only met with courage. The 3 Norns, past, present, and future, wove the threads of every life, and even the gods were subject to their weaving. You could not change what would happen, you could only control how you faced it. This created a spirituality focused on honor, courage, and glory rather than reward or salvation. The deed mattered more than the outcome because the outcome was already written. Daily worship happened not in temples but at sacred groves, at outdoor altars, in the halls where communities gathered. Bleats were sacrificial feasts where animals were killed, and their blood sprinkled on altars and participants. The meat then shared in communal meals. Oaths were sworn on arm, rings consecrated to the gods, and breaking such an oath was among the gravest offences. There were no professional priests for most of the pagan period, no written scripture, no centralized religious authority. The chieftain performed rituals, the head of the household made offerings. Religion was woven into the social fabric rather than separated into distinct institutions, and they knew their gods would die. The prophecy of Ragnarok was explicit and terrible. Odin would be devoured by the wolf Fenrir. Thor would kill the world serpent Jormungandr, but die from its poison. Heimdall and Loki would kill each other. The fire giant Surtur would burn the world. The seas would rise and swallow the land. Everything would end in fire and ice and darkness. Then, the prophecy said, the world would be reborn. A few gods would survive. A human man and woman hidden in the world tree would emerge to repopulate the earth. The cycle would begin again. But the gods the Norse knew and worshipped, Odin, Thor, Freya, all of them, would be gone, dead, finished. What does it mean to worship gods you know will die? It creates a religion of the present moment, of action over contemplation, of courage over hope. If the gods themselves cannot escape fate, then neither can you. But you can die well. You can be remembered. You can earn glory that outlasts your brief life. The Norse did not worship their gods expecting salvation or eternal paradise. They worshipped them as allies in a cosmos that was fundamentally dangerous and ultimately doomed, where the best you could hope for was to face the darkness with courage and die fighting. This acceptance of divine mortality was built into their worldview from the beginning. They had a mythological framework for the death of gods. But this acceptance did not prepare them for what actually happened, because the end of their gods was not glorious battle. It was compromise, adaptation, and slow erosion. Let us look at how Ragnarok actually unfolded, not in fire and ice, but in baptisms and treaty signing. King Olaf Tryggvason gave Norwegians a choice, baptism or death. Many chose death, and yet within 2 generations their children and grandchildren were singing Christian hymns, unable to remember the words to Thor's praises. How do you kill a religion that values death in battle? You make dying for the old gods socially impossible. The missionaries arrived first, in the 9th and 10th centuries, carrying crosses into lands where the cross had no meaning. Ansgar, the apostle of the north, made multiple attempts to establish churches in Denmark and Sweden. He built a few, baptized some converts, then watched his work collapse as soon as he left. The Norse were not particularly interested in a god who preached meekness and turning the other cheek. Their gods were warriors. They valued strength, courage, the willingness to fight. Christianity seemed weak by comparison, but kings saw opportunities the common people did not. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark converted around 960 CE, not necessarily from conviction but from pragmatism. Christian kingdoms in Europe offered trade agreements, military alliances, political legitimacy. A pagan king was a barbarian to be conquered. A Christian king was a potential ally to be courted. Harald built churches, invited missionaries, and proclaimed his conversion on the massive runestone at Jelling. Whether he stopped believing in Odin and Thor, or simply added Christ to his personal pantheon, is a question no runestone answers. For decades, the old and new existed side by side. Churches were built next to sacred groves. People wore Thor's hammer amulets alongside Christian crosses, hedging their bets between competing divine powers. In death, they were buried with both Christian prayers and pagan grave goods, covering all possibilities. This was not hypocrisy, but practical spirituality, in a time when divine allegiances were unclear and the stakes were eternal. Then came the Olafs, and the tolerance ended. Olaf Tryggvason ruled Norway from 995 to 1000 CE, and he was not interested in gradual conversion or peaceful coexistence. He gave clear choices: accept baptism or face execution, exile, torture. He travelled through Norway with armed men, smashing pagan idols, burning sacred sites, executing those who refused the new god. Many resisted, many died. Their deaths did not spark widespread rebellion because Olaf controlled the military power and the political infrastructure. Dying for the old gods became not martyrdom but futile suicide. Olaf II Haraldsson continued the work from 1015 to 1028. The temple at Uppsala in Sweden, described by late pagan sources as magnificent with golden statues of Odin, Thor, and Freyr, was eventually destroyed. Sacred groves where generations had made offerings were cut down, the trees felled and burned, the ground desecrated so thoroughly that even the location of some sites was lost. Holy springs were filled with stones, outdoor altars were demolished. The physical infrastructure of the old religion was systematically erased. Iceland's conversion in 19,000 CA happened differently, but no less completely. The Althing, the assembly of chieftains, debated for a full day whether to accept Christianity or maintain the old ways. The law speaker, Thorgeir Godi, was given the decision. He lay beneath a cloak in silence, thinking, then emerged and declared Iceland would convert to Christianity. But he included a compromise. Private pagan worship would remain legal. Within a generation, even that compromise had eroded. The old religion survived as private practice for a few decades, then as secret tradition, then as nothing at all. Sweden resisted longest. Paganism survived officially until the 12th century in some regions, maintained by traditionalists who saw Christianity as a foreign corruption. But resistance without institutional support cannot last. The oral traditions that preserved the myths required regular retelling in social contexts that no longer existed. The skaldic poetry that referenced the gods lost its audience as fewer people understood the references. The ritual practices that required specific sacred sites became impossible when those sites were destroyed or Christianized. Here is the deepest irony. Most of what we know about Norse mythology comes from Christian sources. The Prose Edda was written by Snorri Sturluson, a Christian Icelander in the 13th century, recording stories he had heard from people who had heard them from people who had believed them. The religion survived in text only after dying in practice, preserved by those who no longer worshipped what they were preserving. The Norse converted or were forced to convert. But something strange happened next. Even after official Christianization, the old gods did not completely disappear. Instead, they transformed into something unexpected: folklore, superstition, and half-remembered stories that haunt Scandinavia to this day. In Iceland today, construction projects are sometimes rerouted to avoid disturbing rocks where people believe elves live. They do not worship these beings. Most do not even literally believe in them, but they respect them just in case. This is what is left when gods die, not nothing, but something stranger. A memory so faded you cannot quite remember what you are remembering, but too persistent to completely forget. The Norse gods did not vanish entirely when Christianity conquered Scandinavia. They were demoted. Thor, who had defended both gods and humans against giants, became a folk hero in stories told by firelight. Then he became a character in fairy tales. His hammer Malnir, once a sacred symbol powerful enough to consecrate marriages and bless the dead, became a lucky charm worn by people who no longer quite remembered why it mattered. But they wore it anyway. Odin transformed into something even stranger. The All-Father, who had sacrificed so much for wisdom, became a recurring figure in Scandinavian folklore, a mysterious one-eyed wanderer who appeared to travelers at crossroads. Sometimes he offered advice. Sometimes he tested the hospitality of those he encountered. He was no longer worshipped, but he was remembered, and the memory carried weight even without the worship. The land footer, the land spirits that had been part of pagan cosmology, survived as superstition. Well into the Christian period, Scandinavians left offerings for these beings at specific rocks, trees, and natural formations. The offerings grew smaller and less frequent over generations, but the practice persisted. People stopped believing the spirits were real in any literal sense, but they continued acting as if they might be, just to be safe. The trolls of Scandinavian folklore may be memories of the giants from Norse mythology, those chaotic beings who lived in Jotunheim and constantly threatened divine order. In the myths, giants were dangerous but not evil, complex beings who sometimes married gods and sometimes fought them. In the folk tales, they became monsters, Scary creatures who turned to stone in sunlight, who threatened children, who lived in dark forests and under bridges. The theological complexity was gone, but the emotional resonance remained. Archaeological evidence reveals the slow transition. Amulets have been found depicting both Christian crosses and Thor's hammers on the same piece of metal, as if the owner wanted protection from all available sources. Burial practices mixed Christian and pagan elements for generations, bodies oriented toward churches, but buried with traditional grave goods, prayers to Christ spoken over the dead while secretly following old funeral rites. The 19th century brought a different kind of remembrance. Romantic nationalism swept Europe, and Scandinavians rediscovered Norse mythology, not as religion, but as cultural heritage. Wagner composed his Ring Cycle based on Norse and Germanic legends. Folk movements collected and published the old stories. Later, problematically, Nazi ideology appropriated Norse symbols and myths, twisting them into propaganda for racial theories the original believers would not have recognized. The gods were dead, but their images could still be used, still carried emotional power even stripped of spiritual content. In modern Iceland, surveys consistently show significant portions of the population claim to believe in elves or at least refuse to deny their existence. These are not the third pagan mythology, not quite. They are something that has evolved over centuries of half-belief and cultural transmission. Most Icelanders who acknowledge elf belief do so with a kind of ironic uncertainty, not worship, not quite skepticism, but something in between. A cultural tradition maintained more from habit and identity than conviction. This transformation from gods to folklore to entertainment to political symbol to tourist curiosity raises an unsettling question. Is this what eventually happens to all forgotten deities? Do they all follow this path from divine to demonic to quaint? The Norse gods survived as stories and shadows, but we have been examining the death of gods one civilization at a time. What if we pull back and ask the bigger question? What are the common mechanisms that kill gods across all cultures? What patterns emerge when we compare these deaths? There are exactly 5 ways for a god to die. Every forgotten deity in history fell victim to one or more of these mechanisms, which means if you are a god in the modern world, you can predict your vulnerability. And if you are a believer, you can see the warning signs before the silence begins. The first path is conquest and syncretism. When one civilization conquers another, the gods rarely survive intact. Alexander's successors merged Greek and Egyptian deities, creating hybrids like Serapis that satisfied neither tradition completely. The Roman Empire subordinated regional gods to Jupiter, teaching conquered peoples that their local deities were merely aspects of greater Roman gods. Islamic expansion reinterpreted pre-Islamic Arabian deities as demons or false idols. The pattern is consistent. The conqueror's gods are elevated, while native gods are reinterpreted, merged, or demoted. This creates theological confusion that weakens belief over generations. When your god can be equated with another culture's god, when the boundaries become fuzzy and the unique identity dissolves, the god loses the sharp definition that made belief possible. The second path is philosophical skepticism. The educated classes begin questioning divine authority in existence, creating a crisis of legitimacy that spreads downward through society. Greek philosophy did this to the Olympians, asking whether gods were truly divine or simply powerful beings subject to higher principles. Buddhist thought challenged Hindu deities by suggesting they were caught in the cycle of rebirth like humans. Enlightenment rationalism questioned whether any gods existed beyond human imagination. This skepticism creates a two-tier society where elites maintain religious practice for social reasons while privately doubting. They attend ceremonies, make offerings, participate in festivals, but the conviction is gone, and when the leaders of a civilization stop believing while continuing to perform the rituals, the religion becomes hollow, it becomes theatre, and eventually people stop attending the performance. The third path is religious replacement. A new religion arrives offering better answers to existential questions, personal relationship with the divine, clear moral frameworks, promises of afterlife reward, emotional satisfaction that old religions no longer provide. Christianity offered salvation where Zeus offered only civic duty. Islam offered submission to a single comprehensible divine will where polytheism offered confusion among competing deities. Buddhism offered escape from suffering where Hinduism offered endless cycles of rebirth. Successful replacement religions understand what people need and provide it more effectively than the old gods can. They do not merely defeat old religions, they make them obsolete. The fourth path is catastrophic disruption. Disaster, disease, or defeat so thorough that divine protection appears absent. When smallpox devastated the Aztec Empire, while Spanish conquistadors remained relatively unaffected, it suggested the Christian God was more powerful than Huitzilopochtli. When Jerusalem fell and the temple was destroyed, it forced radical reinterpretation of what Yahweh's covenant meant. When plague swept through regions and killed believers and non-believers equally, it undermined confidence that the gods were protecting the faithful. Civilizations cope with such disruptions in various ways, reinterpreting disaster as divine punishment, switching allegiance to deities who seem more protective, or questioning whether divine power exists at all. But the confidence is shaken, and confidence once broken is difficult to restore. The fifth path is generational amnesia. Knowledge, language, and practice are lost through cultural change, migration, or institutional collapse. Mesopotamian religion faded because each generation learned less of the sacred languages. Fewer young people became priests. The rituals continued, but their meanings were forgotten. Indigenous American religions were disrupted by forced relocations that separated people from sacred sites. Pre-literate traditions depended on oral transmission and died when that chain was broken. This is the slowest death, sometimes taking centuries, but it is also the most complete. When the last person who understands the prayers dies, when the language itself is lost, the gods become literally unspeakable. Most divine deaths combine multiple mechanisms. Christianity did not simply replace Zeus. It arrived when Greek philosophy had already created doubt, when Roman political changes had subordinated regional gods, when social transformation made people seek new spiritual meanings. The mechanisms work together, each weakening the structure until it collapses. The speed varies dramatically. Military religious conquest can kill gods in decades. Generational amnesia takes centuries or millennia. But the ending is always the same: silence where prayer used to be. These 5 mechanisms explain how gods die, but they do not explain why people let them die, because gods do not vanish on their own. Humans abandon them, which raises the question: what makes people willing to forget gods their ancestors would have died to defend? Here is the darkest secret about forgotten gods. People did not lose faith slowly, reluctantly, tragically. Most conversions to new religions happened willingly, even enthusiastically. When Christianity swept through Europe or Islam through the Middle East, millions of people abandoned gods their parents had worshipped without significant resistance, which means the gods were not holding them. The people were holding the gods, and they decided to let go. The fundamental paradox haunts every story of divine death. If you truly believe a god is real and watching, abandoning that god should be psychologically impossible. It would be like denying gravity while standing on the ground, like refusing to acknowledge death while attending a funeral. Your mind cannot simply override reality when reality is staring at you. Yet across cultures, across centuries, people have abandoned gods they claimed were absolutely real, gods they swore they would never forsake, gods their ancestors died defending. The answer lies in cognitive dissonance and the human genius for rationalization. When a new religion offers practical benefits, community support in times of crisis, political advancement under new rulers, trade opportunities with converted neighbors, believers create justifications that allow them to switch while preserving their self-image as morally consistent people. Conquered peoples reinterpreted their defeats. Perhaps our gods approved of this change. Perhaps they were testing us. Perhaps the new god defeated our gods legitimately, proving superior power, and wise people follow power. The mind builds bridges across logical chasms, and those bridges feel solid while you are walking on them. Generational dilution accelerates the process. The first generation converts but maintains private doubts, secret practices, memories of the old ways. They teach their children the new religion, but with hesitation, with qualifications, with nostalgic stories about how things used to be. The children receive mixed messages. They learn the new prayers but hear whispers about the old gods. The third generation knows only the new religion, and the old ways become family stories, quaint traditions, things grandparents talked about. Religious terminology follows this pattern precisely. Sacred words become archaic, then quaint, then incomprehensible, then lost. The language of prayer dies before the memory of prayer, and when the words are gone, the gods truly cannot be called back. Sacred site desecration carries devastating psychological weight. When temples are destroyed without divine retribution, when statues are smashed and nothing happens, when holy groves are cut down and the axes do not turn on the woodcutters, it suggests the gods were not protecting what was theirs. The destruction of the Jerusalem temple forced radical theological reinterpretation. The conversion of the Parthenon to a church announced Athena's defeat in stone and marble. The dismantling of Mesoamerican pyramids demonstrated that gods who required blood could not protect their own altars. Each desecration without consequence is evidence that perhaps the gods were never there, or that they are weaker than claimed, or that they have abandoned their people first. Alternative explanation systems make divine presence unnecessary rather than impossible. When lightning is understood as atmospheric electricity rather than Zeus's anger, Zeus loses a function. When medicine cures diseases without prayer, healing gods become optional. When secular law maintains order without divine commandment, the gods' moral authority evaporates. This is not atheism. Many people continue believing gods exist, but existence without function is a kind of death. A god who does nothing necessary is a god people can afford to ignore. Humans possess a remarkable capacity for metaphorizing beliefs. Literal divine beings become symbolic truths, eternal principles, useful stories, psychological archetypes. This is the halfway house to complete abandonment. Educated Romans spoke of Jupiter as a symbol of authority rather than an actual being. Some modern Christian denominations treat resurrection as metaphor rather than physical event. Once you begin this process, once the literal becomes symbolic, the symbolic eventually becomes optional. Anthropological research reveals that conversion often happens emotionally and socially before intellectual justification follows. You join the community that welcomes you. You adopt the practices that give you social standing. You marry into the new faith. Then you develop theological reasons why this was always the right choice. The heart converts before the head, and the head follows reluctantly, building rational structures to support decisions already made. Trauma accelerates everything. Religious systems that fail to protect believers from catastrophe lose adherents. Not because people stop believing the gods exist, but because they conclude those gods are weak or malevolent. A god who watches your children die, who allows your city to burn, who permits conquest and slavery. Such a god might be real, but is not worth worshipping. Perhaps the question is not how people could abandon their gods, but why they clung to them as long as they did. Faith's persistence despite doubt, disaster, and change might be the greater mystery. We understand the mechanisms and psychology, but these processes leave physical evidence, ruins, artifacts, texts. What happened to the actual temples, statues, and holy sites when the gods died? The physical erasure of divinity is a story of both destruction and transformation. There is a church in Rome built entirely from a pagan temple. Same building, same columns, same marble. They just took out Mars and put in Christ. You can stand inside and see both religions at once. The classical architecture of a war god's sanctuary, with paintings of Christian saints on the walls. It is the perfect metaphor for how gods die. Not vanishing, but being overwritten, like palimpsest manuscript where you can still see the erased text underneath. The most common fate of ancient temples was conversion. New religions did not always destroy what they conquered. Often they occupied it. The Parthenon in Athens became a Christian church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Then an Ottoman mosque, before finally becoming the archaeological site tourists visit today. The Pantheon in Rome survived because it was converted to a Catholic church in the 7th century, and churches are maintained while pagan temples are not. Across Egypt, countless temples bear crosses carved over hieroglyphs, Christian symbols literally covering the faces of gods who had been worshipped for millennia. The symbolism was intentional and powerful. New religions physically occupying the space of old ones demonstrated the transfer of power more effectively than any theological argument. When you pray in a building that once housed a different god, you are standing on conquered ground. Every service is a victory celebration. Every hymn echoes in spaces designed for different songs. The pragmatism was equally straightforward. Religious buildings were often the most substantial architecture available. Stone temples survived when wooden houses rotted. Reusing existing structures was cheaper and faster than building new. Why quarry fresh stone when perfectly good blocks already stand assembled? The sacred became practical, and in becoming practical, it ceased to be sacred. But conversion was not always the choice. Deliberate destruction swept through regions where new faiths demanded complete erasure of the old. Christian mobs attacked the Serapeum in Alexandria in 391 CE, tearing down the massive statue of Serapis and destroying one of the ancient world's greatest libraries in their zeal to eliminate pagan knowledge. Islamic expansion demolished pre-Islamic Arabian shrines, smashing idols, and erasing the physical evidence of polytheism. Spanish conquistadors toppled Aztec temples and used the stones to build churches directly on top of sacred sites, so that Christian priests offered mass above the buried altars where human hearts had been offered to Huitzilopochtli. The psychology of destruction went beyond practical elimination. It was symbolic victory. If your god was real, surely he would defend his own temple. The lack of divine intervention became evidence of divine absence. Each smashed statue, each demolished altar, each burned sacred grove was proof that the old gods were powerless or non-existent. The destruction converted through demonstration. Many temples met a quieter end through simple abandonment and decay. When populations moved, when religions changed, when civilizations collapsed, the buildings were left to weather and erosion, and stone robbers looking for ready-made construction materials. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, was quarried so thoroughly that almost nothing recognizable remains. Natural decay can be as complete as deliberate destruction, just slower and without the drama. The 19th and 20th centuries brought archaeological rediscovery, creating a strange afterlife for these sites. Ancient temples became tourist attractions and museums, their religious purpose replaced by educational and economic functions. Ironically, temples destroyed by time are often better preserved in archaeological record than those continuously repurposed, because repurposing destroys the original context that archaeologists need to understand the past. Ethical questions haunt these ruins. Should we reconstruct them, like the ongoing debates over the Parthenon marbles? Leave them as evocative ruins? Convert them back to functioning religious sites for modern practitioners trying to revive dead traditions? The Hagia Sophia has been church, mosque, museum, and mosque again. Its multiple transformations, showing how sacred space remains contested long after original religions die. The gods themselves, or at least their physical representations, met various fates. Statues were deliberately broken, faces removed to symbolically kill the depicted deity. Some were melted down for their metal value, the divine reduced to raw materials. Believers trying to preserve sacred objects buried them, creating caches archaeologists later discover. Some statues were repurposed as decoration, stripped of religious meaning and treated as art. What has been lost goes beyond the physical. We have the shells of temples but rarely understand their sensory reality. We do not know the sounds, the specific chants, the music, the acoustics that made voices feel divinely amplified. We do not know the smells, which incenses burned, how smoke moved through the space, whether certain perfumes marked special occasions. We do not know the emotional atmosphere that made these spaces feel sacred rather than merely old. The architecture survived better than the experience of sacredness it housed. The temples tell one story, but there is another place where the gods left traces, a place we are still excavating, still discovering, and still trying to understand. A place where the gods might not be as dead as we thought, the ground itself, waiting for archaeologists to uncover its secrets. In 1850, a British archaeologist in Iraq excavated what he thought was just another mud, brick mound. He uncovered a library, the Library of Ashurbanipal, containing thousands of clay tablets. Among them was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest written story. It contained a flood myth almost identical to Noah. Suddenly, scholars realized the Bible was not the original. It was copying older stories about older gods. What else had we gotten wrong? The 19th century brought an explosion of archaeological discovery that fundamentally changed how humanity understood its religious past. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 brought scholars alongside soldiers, and they returned with descriptions of monuments so massive and ancient that Europe struggled to comprehend them. The race to decipher cuneiform in Mesopotamia revealed entire civilizations that had been forgotten so completely they existed only as fragmentary references in classical texts. Schliemann excavated Troy and proved that Homer's epics described real places. Each discovery carried the same shocking implication. Sophisticated religions with millions of believers had vanished so thoroughly that later generations did not even know they had existed. Specific breakthrough moments changed everything. In 1822, Jean-François Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone, and suddenly thousands of years of Egyptian religious texts became readable. Temple walls that had been silent for millennia began speaking again, describing rituals, recounting myths, naming gods. In the 1840s, Henry Rawlinson decoded the Behistun inscription, unlocking Akkadian and other Mesopotamian languages. Gods whose names had not been spoken in 2,000 years, Marduk, Ishtar, Enlil, returned to human knowledge, pulled from oblivion by scholars who could finally read the clay tablets scattered across the Iraqi desert. Archaeology reveals what texts cannot. Religious texts describe official theology, what priests and kings wanted people to believe. Archaeology shows what people actually did. Votive offerings reveal daily religious practice, the small prayers of ordinary people, not grand state ceremonies. The evolution of iconography shows how God concepts changed across centuries. Evidence distinguishes popular religion from official state cults, revealing that what the temple proclaimed and what households practiced were often different things. The discoveries create vivid pictures. Thousands of cat mummies at Egyptian sites reveal the extent of Bastet worship, common people spending precious resources to mummify cats as offerings, an obsession the official texts barely mention. Household shrines at Pompeii show how Romans interacted daily with lares and penates, the domestic gods protecting their homes. Offering pits at Scandinavian temples filled with sacrificed weapons and treasures demonstrate the scale of devotion to Norse gods, wealth thrown into bogs and marshes as gifts to divine beings. Archaeological techniques reconstruct what texts never recorded. Stratigraphy reveals how temples were built, modified over centuries and eventually abandoned. You can see the layers of use, the alterations that show changing theology, the final abandonment when no one came anymore. Iconographic analysis tracks how God images evolved, sometimes documenting theological shifts that happened too gradually for anyone to record in writing. Residue analysis detects ancient incense and offerings, identifying which plants burned in specific temples, which oils anointed which statues. A crucial insight emerges: religious texts often lie. Official inscriptions claim universal devotion, while archaeological evidence reveals resistance, syncretism, people mixing traditions that officials claimed were pure. Recent discoveries continue rewriting understanding. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey suggests complex religion predates agriculture, challenging assumptions about how civilization developed. Warrior women's graves across the Eurasian steppes challenge assumptions about gender and religious roles. Evidence of female priests appears in cultures previously assumed entirely patriarchal. Archaeologists describe strange experiences excavating religious sites, an uncanny feeling in ancient sanctuaries, as if sacred atmosphere lingers after its source vanishes. Moments when the past feels uncomfortably present, when you stand where someone last prayed 3,000 years ago and feel the weight of that final prayer hanging in the air. But archaeology has limits. We can reconstruct rituals, but not the subjective experience of belief. We can identify sacred spaces, but not why specific locations felt holy. We can catalogue gods, but not why people loved them. The physical remains survive. The faith that animated them does not. Archaeology has brought back gods who were completely forgotten, but the discoveries are not finished. Right now, under the ground in dozens of countries, there are temples we have not found yet. And in those temples might be gods whose names have not been spoken in 3,000 years, waiting in darkness. Let us visit some of these sites, the places where archaeologists are still listening for divine whispers. In 2016, archaeologists using LiDAR scanned the Amazon rainforest and discovered something impossible: thousands of previously unknown earthwork sites, including massive geometric patterns that could only be sacred. An entire civilization with its own gods had been hiding under the trees. The survey covered less than 10% of the Amazon, which means under that canopy right now, there are probably hundreds of forgotten gods whose names we have never heard, whose temples we have never seen, waiting in the darkness to be either discovered or destroyed as the forest burns. The excavations happening today are bringing gods back from oblivion in real time. At Angkor Wat in Cambodia, teams continue uncovering evidence of complex Hindu-Buddhist syncretism that challenges clean narratives about religious boundaries. Previously unknown deities emerge from the jungle, beings worshipped by millions who left no written theology, only stone faces staring from temple walls, their names and stories lost until archaeologists piece together fragments of iconography and trace elements of ritual. Beneath Alexandria, Harbor, underwater archaeologists work in cold Mediterranean darkness, mapping the remains of Cleopatra's palace and temple districts where Isis and Serapis were worshipped. The city that was once the intellectual capital of the ancient world, where the library held knowledge from across the known world, now lies submerged. Divers bring up statues, inscriptions, architectural fragments. Each object is a piece of divine puzzle, gods preserved by the water that drowned them. In Saudi Arabia, excavations proceed quietly, politically sensitive in a modern Islamic state. Pre-Islamic Arabian polytheism is being uncovered. Shrines, inscriptions, evidence of gods whose worship was forbidden and then forgotten after Islam's arrival. These discoveries exist in tension with religious narratives that prefer to treat pre-Islamic Arabia as a time of ignorance rather than alternative belief. The gods being rediscovered challenge the simplicity of that story. Peru's coastal deserts yield Mosha civilization secrets, a complete cosmology entirely unknown until recent decades. Gods that ruled the Andes, that demanded sacrifice, that shaped art and architecture and political power, none of it recorded in writing because the Mosha had no written language. The gods existed only in practice, in ritual, in the memories of believers. When the believers died, the gods became literally unspeakable until archaeology gave them form again. Technology accelerates discovery in ways previous generations could not imagine. LiDAR penetrates jungle canopies, revealing temple complexes invisible from ground level. Penetrating radar finds tombs and sanctuaries without digging, mapping underground sacred spaces. DNA analysis reveals migration patterns and religious spread. You can track how gods moved with the people who carried them. Isotope analysis traces pilgrimage routes, showing which individuals traveled to worship at distant shrines, mapping devotion through chemistry. Archaeologists describe the experience of discovering unknown gods with mixture of excitement and unease. You realize entire belief systems existed that we knew nothing about. Millions of people organized their lives around these beings, and we forgot completely. The discovery feels like resurrection, but resurrection into what? Museums, academic papers, tourism revenue, politics shadows every excavation. Who owns the past? Governments claim artifacts found within their borders. Source countries demand repatriation of objects taken during colonial periods. Religious groups want access to sites their distant ancestors worshipped, claiming spiritual connection across millennia. Nationalist movements use archaeological discoveries to construct preferred historical narratives. Some discoveries challenge contemporary religious beliefs. Evidence of religious evolution, borrowing, synthesis. Findings that true believers prefer not acknowledging. Hindu nationalists oppose evidence complicating Aryan migration narratives. Christians grow uncomfortable with archaeological evidence of Judaism's polytheistic roots. Muslims resist excavating pre-Islamic sites that reveal sophisticated religions rather than primitive ignorance. The race against time intensifies. Climate change threatens coastal sites with rising seas and increased storms. Urban development bulldozes archaeological layers before they can be documented. Looting flourishes in politically unstable regions where ancient artifacts fund modern conflicts. The contexts that give discoveries meaning disappear faster than archaeologists can record them. Economics determines which gods return to knowledge. Archaeology requires funding, and funding follows interests. Egyptian gods get rediscovered because Egypt tourism generates revenue. Mesopotamian sites get excavated when political stability permits and oil money provides support. Gods of poor regions, of politically inconvenient civilizations, of places without strategic importance remain buried, waiting for resources that may never come. Archaeologists estimate we have excavated less than 1% of ancient sites. The vast majority of forgotten gods are still literally buried, waiting. These discoveries are bringing gods back from oblivion, but into what? They are not being worshipped again, they are being studied, catalogued, displayed in museums, which raises a question: have we truly brought these gods back, or have we just moved them from one kind of death to another? The god Moloch demanded child sacrifice. The goddess Kali wore a necklace of severed heads. The god Tezcatlipoca was fed the hearts of captured warriors. Today, these gods sit in glass cases where schoolchildren point at them during field trips. Is this a triumph of civilization over barbarism, or the saddest possible ending for beings once so terrifying that entire civilizations organize themselves around keeping them satisfied? Walk through the British Museum and you encounter Egyptian gods standing under fluorescent lights behind glass barriers. These statues were created for dark sanctuaries where only priests could approach, where incense smoke obscured their features, where the very act of seeing them was considered dangerous for unprepared mortals. Now, tourists photograph them casually, children press sticky fingers against the glass, and museum guards yawn through their shifts, watching over beings that once commanded absolute terror and devotion. The Aztec Sunstone sits in Mexico City's National Museum of Anthropology, roped off from the public. It was meant to serve. This massive carved disc represented the cosmos itself, the cycles of creation and destruction, the god Tenacia, who required human blood to continue his journey across the sky. It was not meant to be looked at from behind velvet ropes. It was meant to loom above sacrificial altars, to be splattered with blood, to be the last thing captives saw before obsidian blades opened their chests. In Stockholm and Oslo, Thor's hammers are displayed as antiquities. Small carved representations of Melnir, once worn as sacred protection, now sit in climate-controlled cases with explanatory placards describing their historical and cultural context. The objects remain. The belief that made them powerful is gone. The debates around these displays grow heated. Indigenous groups demand repatriation of sacred objects, arguing that museum display is itself a form of desecration. How can you preserve the sacred by removing it from sacred context? Museums counter that they preserve cultural heritage and make it accessible to millions who would never visit original sites. Some objects are so removed from living practice that no one claims them, the gods too forgotten to have advocates. Specific controversies reveal the complexity. Greece demands return of the Parthenon marbles from the British Museum, arguing they are stolen pieces of national heritage. The British Museum insists they preserve and protect what might be damaged or destroyed in Greece. Egyptian mummies are displayed to curious crowds in what amounts to public exhibition of deceased humans' bodies, their original burial for eternal rest, violated for educational purposes. Native American sacred objects fall under NAGPRA legislation, requiring museums to consult with tribes before display, acknowledging that some objects should not be seen by those outside the tradition. The philosophical paradox cuts deep. By preserving artifacts in museums, we have made them immortal in one sense. They will exist for thousands more years, protected from weather, war, and decay. But they are dead in another sense, forever severed from their original function. A statue meant for worship becomes an object of study. An altar meant for sacrifice becomes a curiosity behind glass. The physical form survives while the meaning dies. Do museums provide afterlife for gods? They live in images and objects, but without power, without worship, without believers. They exist as concepts you can point to, but not forces you must appease. Perhaps this is the strangest fate, to be remembered but not believed, known but not feared, preserved but powerless. The tourist industry extends this strange existence beyond museums. Machu Picchu, the pyramids, Angkor Wat, on sacred spaces now generate revenue, their spiritual significance reduced to photo opportunities and historical interest. Guides explain what people believed the way you might explain the rules of a board game no longer played. The sites remain impressive. The sacredness has evaporated. Some attempts at preservation backfire. Temple restoration makes ancient structures look fake, too clean, stripped of the patina that testified to their age. Ritual reconstructions as tourist performances turn profound religious experiences into entertainment. Commercialization transforms sacred objects into kitsch. You can buy miniature pyramids in Cairo gift shops, Thor's hammer as jewelry in Scandinavian airports. Perhaps this secular preservation is appropriate. These religions are dead. Museums are cultural cemeteries, respectful but final. Yet the irony persists. Ancient peoples would be horrified at their gods' current existence. Yet museum display has made these deities more widely known than they were at the height of their power. A statue of Ra seen by millions of museum visitors annually has more exposure than it had when only priests could approach it in its sanctuary. Museums represent a new phase in divine death, not oblivion, but fossilization, where gods exist as historical curiosities rather than living forces. Museums preserve the dead gods, but what about the nearly dead? The gods whose believers are disappearing but who are not yet gone? And what about the opposite phenomenon, gods who died but then, improbably, were revived? The fate of forgotten gods is not always one-directional. Sometimes the forgotten are remembered again. When missionaries arrived in Ireland, they encountered Brigid, one of the most powerful goddesses in Celtic religion. They could not make the Irish forget her. She was too beloved, too central, so they converted her instead. She became Saint Brigid, a Christian holy woman who happened to have a suspiciously pagan biography. For centuries, Irish Catholics prayed to someone who started as a goddess and ended as a saint. The name survived, but was it still the same being? Christianity developed a strategy for dealing with gods it could not erase: demotion. Completely eliminating beloved local deities often created resistance that threatened conversion efforts. Church authorities learned to compromise. The old gods could remain, but demoted and reframed. No longer sovereign powers, they became either saints who could intercede with the one true God, or demons who served Satan. The choice depended on how amenable the local population was to abandoning their traditional protectors. Saint Brigid's feast day falls on February 1st, conveniently coinciding with Imbolc, the pagan festival marking spring's approach. Her associations with fire, poetry, healing, and smithcraft mirror precisely the domains of the goddess Brigid. The church claimed she was a 5th century abbess. The Irish knew better, or at least remembered something deeper beneath the Christian veneer. They prayed to her as they always had, simply adjusting the theological framework around unchanged devotion. The Norse fertility goddess Freya underwent similar transformation. Her attributes were distributed among the Virgin Mary and various female saints. Prayers for fertility, for safe childbirth, for protection of livestock, these shifted from Freya to Mary, the functions preserved while the name changed. Converts maintained the same practical spirituality under new management. Other gods fared worse in the transformation. Pan, the Greek god of wild places, provided the visual template for the Christian devil. His goat legs, his horns, his association with sexuality and untamed nature. All of this made him perfect for reimagining as evil incarnate. Celtic deities of the underworld became devils and dangerous spirits to be avoided rather than honored. Mesopotamian and Canaanite gods mentioned in the Bible like Baal and Asherah were recast as demons and false idols, their names becoming synonyms for evil rather than alternative divinity. The psychological effect was profound. This strategy allowed converts to maintain continuity while officially adopting new religion. An Irish Catholic praying to Saint Bridget could hold layers of meaning, the official Christian narrative, and the half-remembered knowledge that this saint was once something more. The demotion preserved emotional connections while severing theological independence. The folklore dimension extended the pattern. Greek nymphs became fairies and nature spirits in European folklore, beautiful and dangerous beings associated with specific locations. Norse landfooter became elves and trolls in Scandinavian tales. Roman household gods became house spirits and ghosts, no longer worshipped but still acknowledged, still sometimes offered small courtesies. The beings remained recognizable but reduced, their cosmic significance shrunk to local influence. This process preserved basic personalities and domains while stripping sovereign power. Thor was not forgotten. He became a strong folk hero in stories, his hammer a symbol rather than sacred object. Frau Holly retained her association with winter and spinning but lost her worship, becoming a figure in fairy tales rather than prayers. The gods demoted to folklore kept their characteristics, but lost their authority. The class dimension matters. Peasants maintained dual consciousness longer than urban populations. They attended church, received sacraments, officially embraced Christianity. But in daily life, in protective rituals, in agricultural customs, they followed patterns that predated Christ by centuries. They blessed fields in ways that suspiciously resembled pagan offerings. They honored saints who looked remarkably like the old gods wearing new names. This transformation path represents a middle stage in divine death. The gods are not worshipped in their original forms, but they are not forgotten. They exist in liminal space between full existence and complete oblivion, neither fully alive nor entirely dead. They persist as memory, as habit, as cultural residue. Some gods survived as saints and demons, but others took a different path. They went underground, maintained secretly by believers who refused to abandon them, even when their religion was officially dead. Let us explore the hidden temples and secret practitioners who kept forbidden gods alive. In 1620, in a village in Lithuania, Catholic priests recorded their frustration. Despite a century of Christianization, local peasants were still making offerings to oak trees, still singing hymns to pre-Christian gods, still consulting with women who claimed to speak with ancient spirits. The priests could not stop it, and in some Lithuanian villages they never did. Today, there are Lithuanians who claim unbroken lineage to those pre-Christian practitioners. They might be the last living link to a religion that officially died 1,000 years ago. The official death of a religion does not always mean its actual death. In the remote Mani region of Greece, pagan Hellenic religion survived until the 9th century, 4 centuries after Christianity became the Roman Empire's official faith. Geographical isolation protected what authority could not reach. Mountains, islands, deserts, these places allowed old religions to persist, because enforcing conversion in every remote village was impossible or simply not worth the effort. Medieval Europe harbored crypto-pagans who mastered the art of dual existence. They attended church on Sunday, received sacraments, professed Christ publicly, but in their homes they maintained shrines to old gods. In their fields, they performed rituals that predated Christianity by centuries. They spoke Christian language in public and pagan language in private, code, switching between worlds with practiced ease. Remote Russian and Baltic villages maintained pre-Christian Slavic religion well into the Christian era. The priests who visited periodically could baptize, could preach, could threaten, but they could not stay, and when they left, the villagers returned to the sacred groves, to the old prayers, to the gods who had protected their ancestors before the cross arrived. Pre-Islamic Iranian Zoroastrianism survived in isolated mountain communities where conversion was incomplete or reversed in secret after conquerors departed. Indigenous American religions found survival through disguise. Catholic syncretism allowed old gods to hide behind Christian saints. The Virgin of Guadalupe could be honored by both Spanish priests and indigenous peoples who saw in her the goddess Tonantzin wearing new clothing. Rituals continued, meanings preserved, the spiritual core maintained beneath acceptable exteriors. The practices required constant vigilance. Shrines hidden in houses or at natural sites visited only when safe. Festivals timed to coincide with Christian holidays, the pagan and Christian celebrations overlapping enough to provide cover. Myths and rituals transmitted orally because written records could be discovered and used as evidence of heresy. Christian language and imagery used to encode pagan, meaning creating layers of interpretation that protected true believers while satisfying authorities. The psychology was complex. Fear motivated secrecy, execution, exile, torture awaited those caught practicing forbidden faiths. Nostalgia played its role. These were the gods of ancestors, the traditions that connected present to past, but genuine belief remained strongest. These practitioners maintained their faiths not from sentiment or rebellion, but because they believed the gods were real, present, necessary. The sad reality is that most secret traditions eventually died anyway. Maintaining complex religious practice without community support, without written tradition, without social legitimization is extraordinarily difficult. Each generation passes on less knowledge than the one before. The chain weakens until it breaks. Stories of last practitioners carry particular poignancy. Final initiates into Eleusinian mysteries, claiming to maintain secret knowledge into medieval periods. The last temple keeper at Philae in Egypt maintaining rituals decades after official prohibition, alone in darkness, performing ceremonies for gods only he remembered. Baltic pagan practices documented by Christian authorities trying to stamp them out, the records becoming unintentional preservation of what they sought to destroy. A haunting question emerges: if a religion survives only in fragments, some rituals, some memories, but no complete theological framework or community, is it truly alive or merely a ghost? Modern examples complicate the answer. Baltic paganism revived in Lithuania and Latvia draws on folk practices that never completely died. Indigenous American spirituality persists despite centuries of suppression. African traditional religions survived diaspora through syncretism with Christianity and Islam. These survivals reveal how much was lost. The fragments that persisted only emphasize how much did not, making the silence more profound rather than less. Some forgotten gods survived in secret, in fragments, in disguises. But perhaps most surprising is what happened in the modern era. Some dead gods have been deliberately revived. Not metaphorically, not academically, but with actual believers building actual temples and performing actual rituals to gods no one has worshipped for millennia. Let us examine the strange phenomenon of divine resurrection. In 2015, Iceland approved construction of the first major Norse pagan temple, built in nearly 1,000 years. It is a domed building on a hill overlooking Reykjavik, designed for public worship of Odin, Thor, and Freya. When it opens, there will be ceremonies, weddings, and naming rituals for gods who have not been publicly worshipped since the Middle Ages. But here is the question that haunts the archaeologists and theologians. Is this revival of an ancient religion, or invention of a new one wearing an old name? If you build a temple to a dead god, do you resurrect it, or do you just create a monument? The neo-pagan movement emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries from multiple sources. Romantic nationalism sought ancient roots for modern nations. Occult movements explored pre-Christian spirituality as alternative to dominant faiths. Reaction against industrialization and Christianity drove some to seek older, more nature-centered worldviews. From these origins came attempts to resurrect gods who had been silent for centuries or millennia. Sutray, the revival of Norse paganism, gained official recognition as a religion in Iceland in 1973. Practitioners built communities around worship of Odin, Thor, Freya, the same gods their ancestors abandoned during medieval Christianization. In Greece, Hellenic polytheism emerged with groups like Wyse claiming to restore ancient Greek religion, performing rituals to Zeus and Athena, using reconstructed ancient practices. Kemeticism attempts to revive Egyptian religion, with practitioners studying hieroglyphs and temple inscriptions to recreate ceremonies for Ra and Osiris. Druid revival movements flourish in Britain and Ireland. Slavic native faith, called Rodnovery, spreads through Eastern Europe, reclaiming pre-Christian Slavic deities. These movements attempt ambitious reconstruction. They study ancient sources, piecing together ritual practices from fragmentary texts and archaeological evidence. Where ancient practices are irrecoverable, they create new ones that feel appropriate to ancient spirit, if not ancient letter. They build communities around shared worship. They seek legal recognition as legitimate religions deserving the same protections and rights as Christianity or Islam. But are these the same religions their practitioners claim to revive? The challenges are profound. Ancient languages are learned academically, not absorbed from native speakers. Cultural contexts are completely different. Modern practitioners live in industrial democracies with scientific worldviews, not agricultural societies where gods explained thunder and harvest. Most theological details are unknown, lost when the last believers died. The unbroken tradition these revivals claim is broken by centuries or millennia of silence. Practitioners often argue these challenges do not matter. Gods exist independently of continuous tradition. Sincere worship recreates authentic connection regardless of historical gaps. Revival honors ancestors and fills spiritual needs. Christianity no longer satisfies for many people. The religion is not the specific practices but the relationship with divine beings who never stopped existing, only stopped being worshipped. Scholars offer harsher criticism. These are inventions, not restorations. They are shaped more by modern concerns, environmentalism, feminism, nationalism, than ancient reality. Practitioners are playing dress up with archaeology, creating fantasy versions of past religions rather than continuing them. The gods being worshipped are modern constructions wearing ancient names. Politics complicates everything. Some Norse pagan groups have white nationalist associations, using Viking imagery for racist ideology. Other groups explicitly reject racism, emphasizing that ancient religions were not racially exclusive. Some governments support revivals as cultural heritage worth preserving. Others view them as threats to dominant religions or social stability. Fascinating details emerge from these movements. The first legal pagan wedding in Iceland in the 1970s. New temples constructed using archaeological evidence to match ancient designs. Debates about appropriate ritual practice. Should animal sacrifice be revived or is vegetarian offering acceptable? Attempts to read ancient texts as living scripture rather than historical documents. The paradox cuts to the heart of religious authenticity. These revivals are simultaneously authentic. Believers genuinely worship these gods with real devotion, and invented. They are creating new religions inspired by old ones rather than continuing them. But perhaps this distinction matters less than it seems. Perhaps all religions are continuously reinvented. Perhaps authenticity is less important than meaning and community. A provocative question lingers if these revivals succeed. If in 1,000 years there are thriving communities worshipping Odin and Zeus, Will historians say these gods died and were resurrected, or that they never truly died because they survived in texts and imagination, waiting for revival? Modern revivals show that some gods can be resurrected, at least in form, but these revivals are scattered, marginal, and face constant questions of legitimacy. For every Norse pagan temple built, there are 1,000 gods no one is trying to revive, gods so forgotten that we do not even have their names. Which brings us to the present day, to the archaeologists and scholars actively searching for these lost divinities, racing against time to document what is left before it is gone forever. Right now, in a museum basement in Iraq, there is a clay tablet covered in cuneiform writing that no one has read in 2,600 years. It has been photographed and is part of a digital database. An AI might translate it next year or next decade. It might contain a prayer to a god whose name we do not know, whose attributes we have never heard of, who was beloved enough that someone took the time to press their words into clay. But right now, in this moment, that God is still unknown, existing in a strange liminal state, preserved but unread, saved but not yet understood. The race to save ancient religions has entered the digital age. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative has photographed and made searchable over 334,000 cuneiform tablets. Many contain religious texts about Mesopotamian gods never fully translated. They sit in databases waiting for scholars with the expertise and time to decode them. Each tablet is a potential revelation. A god's name spoken for the first time in millennia, a ritual practice we never knew existed, a theological concept that challenges everything we thought we understood. Egyptian hieroglyphic texts from temples, tombs, and papyri are being digitized at unprecedented rates. Multispectral imaging reads erased or degraded manuscripts, revealing texts invisible to the naked eye. Medieval monks scraped religious texts off valuable parchment to reuse it for their own purposes, but the original writing left chemical traces. Technology recovers what was deliberately destroyed, bringing back prayers that someone worked very hard to erase. Three-dimensional modeling creates digital twins of temples and religious sites threatened by climate change, conflict, and tourism. You can explore a Mesopotamian temple in virtual reality, see how light would have fallen through doorways during solstice, hear how chants would have echoed in the sanctuary. The experience is historically accurate down to the placement of altars and the scent of specific incenses, but you cannot pray there meaningfully. It is preservation as data rather than living practice, immortality without life. The urgency is real. Tablets crumble as humidity and temperature fluctuate in inadequate storage. Sites are destroyed faster than they can be documented. Scholars estimate thousands of untranslated religious texts exist in museum basements and private collections, waiting for attention they may never receive. Each year, some are lost to decay, theft, or simple neglect. Satellites and drones map archaeological sites from above, revealing patterns invisible at ground level. Artificial intelligence assists in translating ancient languages, identifying religious terminology and patterns across thousands of texts faster than human scholars ever could. The technology is imperfect, but it accelerates discovery, flagging tablets that contain divine names or ritual instructions for human experts to examine more closely. Digital projects reveal surprises. Gods previously unknown appear in casual letters or administrative documents, not grand theological texts, but everyday references that show these deities were real parts of daily life. Variant forms of myths suggest oral traditions were far more diverse than the literary versions that survived. Evidence of common people's religious practices emerges, not just elite perspectives preserved in official inscriptions. Specific discoveries demonstrate technology's power. Linear B decipherment revealed Mycenaean Greek religion, proving Greek gods were worshipped centuries before Homer. Damaged Dead Sea Scrolls were read using imaging technology, showing Jewish religious diversity that official texts suppressed. Archimedes' mathematical work was recovered from a medieval prayer book where monks had scraped it off, demonstrating how sacred texts were recycled when religions changed and their contents became worthless. The paradox haunts the work. We are preserving these religions in unprecedented detail, creating archives that will outlast the original clay tablets and stone inscriptions. But we are preserving them as historical data, cultural heritage, academic interest. The digital temple you can explore in virtual reality is not a place of worship. It is a museum exhibit you wear on your face. Democratization promises wider access. Digital archives make ancient texts available to anyone with internet connection, but translation remains specialized, requiring years of training in dead languages. You can see the tablet. You still need an expert to tell you what it says. Challenges multiply. The sheer volume overwhelms available scholarly attention. Thousands of tablets are photographed but unread because there are not enough cuneiformists. Digital preservation faces its own obsolescence as file formats and storage media change. Will databases created today be readable in a century? Some governments restrict access to archaeological data for political or religious reasons, fearing what ancient truths might challenge modern narratives, but hope persists. AI translation assistants might accelerate understanding, revealing gods and practices still hidden in untranslated texts, waiting in digital darkness for the algorithm that will finally read them. Technology is giving us tools to preserve and understand ancient religions, but preservation is a race against destruction. While we digitize tablets, climate change floods archaeological sites. While we translate texts, urban development bulldozes temples. Let us examine the forces actively destroying the physical evidence of ancient gods, making the race against time more urgent than ever. In 2015, ISIS militants took sledgehammers to 3,000-year-old Assyrian statues in the Mosul Museum. They were following a theological imperative: destroy idols. But they were also destroying irreplaceable evidence of how ancient peoples understood divinity. Every statue they smashed was a god that will now never be fully understood. The video of the destruction went viral. Millions watched ancient gods die for the second time. First when their believers died, now when their physical evidence was demolished. Palmyra fell weeks later. The temple columns that had stood for 2 millennia were reduced to rubble by explosives. Hatra, once a magnificent religious center where Arabian, Greek, and Mesopotamian gods were worshipped together, was bulldozed into dust. The justification was always the same. These were idols, affronts to pure monotheism. But the result was erasure of archaeological evidence that might have revealed how ancient religions actually functioned, how people prayed, what they believed happened after death. 6 years before ISIS, the Taliban demonstrated what religious extremism could accomplish with enough explosives. The Bamiyan Buddhas carved into Afghan cliffs in the 6th century were monumental proof that Buddhism once flourished across Central Asia. Artillery shells and dynamite took weeks to destroy them completely. When the dust settled, those massive stone faces were gone, and with them went irreplaceable evidence of how Buddhism adapted and merged with local traditions in a region now dominated by Islam. The motivations are complex. Religious extremism sees ancient idols as living threats, not historical artifacts. Political movements reject pre-Islamic or pre-national histories as colonial inventions or embarrassing reminders of diversity. Nationalist narratives work better when the past appears uniform and the present faith appears eternal. But ideology isn't the only destroyer. In Cairo, Lima, and Baghdad, urban sprawl paves over unexcavated sites daily. Developers can wait for archaeologists to document what lies beneath future apartment buildings. Illegal looters, driven by Western demand for antiquities, dynamite tombs and temples, destroying context to extract sellable objects. Mining operations and agricultural expansion in Africa and South America bulldoze sites that haven't even been discovered yet by archaeologists. Osiris, the ancient port city on India's coast, was partially destroyed by modern port construction before excavators could fully document its extraordinary evidence of Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Jewish syncretism. Indigenous American sacred sites lie beneath reservoir waters, flooded by dam projects that prioritized electricity over archaeology. In Africa, infrastructure development destroys sites faster than archaeologists can even survey them. Then there is climate change, working slowly but inexorably. Rising sea levels threaten Alexandria's submerged temples. Increased rainfall erodes the mud, brick ziggurats of Mesopotamia and the adobe temples of Peru. Desertification buries some sites and exposes others to destructive weathering. In the Arctic, permafrost melt reveals ancient sites that then rapidly degrade before they can be properly documented. Tourism presents its own paradox. Visitor fees fund preservation, but foot traffic, humidity from breath, and pollution damage the very sites being protected. Lascaux Cave's prehistoric paintings are now closed to visitors. Similar debates rage over Angkor Wat and Machu Picchu. The prioritization problem is brutal. Limited resources force impossible choices: which sites get protected, which get documented before destruction, which are simply abandoned to their fate. The uncomfortable truth is that destruction is new. Christians demolished pagan temples and built churches on their foundations. Muslims destroyed pre-Islamic sites. China's cultural revolution systematically destroyed religious sites. Each era erases the previous era's sacred places. Ethical questions multiply. How much should modern societies invest in preserving ancient religions nobody believes in anymore? Who decides which sites matter? Can a dam project that brings electricity to millions be stopped to preserve a temple to a forgotten god? Archaeologists estimate we lose thousands of archaeological sites annually. Countless ancient gods will never be rediscovered because their temples and artifacts are being destroyed faster than they can be excavated. The destruction continues today, not just by extremists, but by urban sprawl, climate change, and simple neglect. Every year, the window to understand humanity's forgotten faiths closes a little tighter. Dr. Guillermo Koch is a Peruvian archaeologist who has spent decades excavating Incan and pre-Incan sites. He is in his 70s now. He says in an interview, "I'm racing against my own death. There are sites I want to excavate, gods I want to understand before I die. But I'm also racing against the site's death, erosion, looting, development. Every archaeologist knows this race. We're documenting the dead while dying ourselves, saving fragments of eternity with mortal hands. It is absurd and it is everything." That urgency drives scholars across the world in Peru. Dr. Alberto Urcia and his team work at Cahuachi, trying to understand Nazca religion before desert winds erase what remains. They excavate through scorching days, documenting temples and offerings, knowing each season brings more erosion. The sand that preserved these structures for centuries is now their destroyer. The Endangered Archives Program funds similar rescue operations worldwide. Researchers photograph crumbling manuscripts in monastery libraries before humidity and insects consume them completely. Every page digitized is a page saved from oblivion. Every text translated adds one more voice to our understanding of how ancient peoples spoke to their gods. In China, archaeologists excavate frantically along the Yangtze River. The Three Gorges Dam project flooded hundreds of archaeological sites. Teams had limited time to dig, document, and move what they could before waters rose. Urban expansion presents similar deadlines. Construction schedules don't wait for complete excavation. Scholars choose, document everything partially or excavate a few sites completely, while others vanish under concrete. Ukrainian scholars face different pressures. They document Scythian religious sites amid ongoing conflict, preserving evidence of nomadic spirituality before battlefields destroy what survived millennia. War makes strange demands on archaeology. Do you risk your life to save a temple that has already survived 2,000 years? These aren't academic exercises, they're rescue operations demanding impossible choices. Which site matters more? Which civilization deserves documentation before disappearing? The decisions scholars make now determine what future generations will know about human religious experience. The personal commitment is extraordinary. Scholars spend entire careers studying civilizations most people never heard of. They learn dead languages spoken by no one else alive. They excavate in deserts, jungles, war zones, and politically hostile regions. They fight for funding in societies that often view ancient religion as curiosity at best, waste of resources at worst. Sometimes they win against time. A team finds an intact burial just days before construction begins. Another translates texts from a building scheduled for demolition. Artifacts are evacuated from war zones hours before destruction arrives. These small victories feel monumental to those involved. International cooperation expands what is possible. Scholars from different countries share digital archives, coordinate coverage, pool resources. They train local archaeologists rather than extracting knowledge as outsiders. They work with communities maintaining oral traditions about ancient sites, combining academic methods with indigenous preservation efforts. What motivates them varies. Some feel responsibility to document human cultural heritage. Some are driven by intellectual curiosity about how humans understand the sacred. Some feel connections to ancient peoples they study as if owing them remembrance. Some simply love the detective work of piecing together lost worlds from fragments. The emotional toll is real. Dealing with destruction of sites you've worked on, knowing your documentation might be the only record surviving. The frustration of insufficient funding, institutional indifference, political obstacles. Watching the library burn while you save individual pages. The philosophical question haunts them. Why preserve knowledge of dead religions? The answers vary. Because all human experience matters. Because understanding the past illuminates the present. Because gods once shaped civilizations and deserve remembrance. Because loss of diversity makes us all poorer. Because who knows what future generations might learn from this knowledge. The bittersweet recognition settles on everyone involved. Despite heroic efforts, most evidence will be lost. They're saving fragments while the library burns, documenting glimpses while the picture fades. But fragments matter. Every god's name preserved, every ritual understood, every temple documented is a small victory against oblivion. The modern hunt continues. Scholars document, technology preserves, dedicated individuals fight against time. But let's step back from the immediate crisis and ask a deeper question. Why does any of this matter? What does the silence of ancient gods teach us about the gods and the humans of today? 2,000 years ago, no one could have imagined a world without Jupiter. The Roman Empire was eternal. Jupiter was the king of gods, and Roman religion would obviously last forever. Today, you can visit Jupiter's temple. It is a ruin. Tour guides explain it to confused tourists who vaguely remember something about mythology. In 2,000 years, will someone be giving tours of St. Peter's Basilica, explaining to confused tourists who vaguely remember something about a religion called Christianity? Every believer says no. It is different. This time, it is real. That is exactly what the Romans said. Every ancient civilization believed their gods would last forever. Egyptian priests couldn't conceive of a time when Raba's name would be forgotten. Greek philosophers assumed the Parthenon would stand until the world's end. Mesopotamian scribes wrote that Marduk's dominion was eternal. They weren't hedging. They weren't speaking metaphorically. They believed it absolutely. Yet today, most people can't name 3 Egyptian gods. The Parthenon is a tourist site where visitors eat lunch on ancient sacred ground. Marduk exists only in academic texts. The gods who shaped civilizations, who received millions of prayers, who inspired magnificent temples and sophisticated theologies, they're gone. What does this teach us about the religions of today? The uncomfortable answer: institutions matter more than theological truth. Cultural transmission matters more than sacred texts. Social utility matters more than divine power. The gods don't preserve themselves. Believers preserve gods. And when believers stop believing, gods vanish regardless of their supposed omnipotence. Contemporary religious decline mirrors ancient patterns with disturbing precision. European churches built to last until the Second Coming stand empty, converted to apartments and nightclubs. The religiously unaffiliated, the nuns, represent the fastest growing category in developed countries. Christmas becomes a secular holiday divorced from Christ. Cultural Judaism thrives while synagogue attendance declines. Religion transforms into aesthetic preference rather than binding truth. The parallels are specific. Educated classes embrace philosophical skepticism, just as Greek intellectuals questioned the gods while temples still stood. Generational dilution occurs where children believe less intensely than parents, the same pattern that slowly drained ancient religions. Syncretism blends Christianity with consumer culture and self-help psychology, creating hybrid faiths barely recognizable to earlier generations. Religious claims get reinterpreted as metaphorical rather than literal, the same retreat that marked dying ancient religions. The statistics are stark. Church attendance across Western Europe hovers in single digits. American religious affiliation drops measurably each decade. Seminaries close for lack of students. Religious communities age while young people drift away. Mosques in some Muslim-majority countries report declining Friday attendance among educated youth. Religious institutions respond defensively. They claim their religion is different because it is actually true. Unlike false ancient religions, they appeal to tradition and authority. They characterize decline as temporary, confined to certain regions, a test of faith before renewal. But uncomfortable questions persist. Are today's religions simply earlier in the process that killed ancient religions? Are Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism fundamentally different from religions that died, or just temporarily successful? If you're a believer, how do you know your God won't be forgotten like Ra and Zeus? Some evidence suggests resilience. Judaism has survived over 3,000 years. Hinduism claims even greater antiquity. These timescales dwarf the lifespan of Egyptian or Greek religion. But survival isn't constant. These religions have changed radically. Ancient Judaism practiced animal sacrifice in a temple. Modern Judaism doesn't. Are they the same religion? Hinduism today barely resembles Vedic religion. The gods have different names, different stories, different worship practices. The ancient forms are as dead as the Egyptian pantheon, even if the tradition claims continuity. Perhaps religious change is continuous evolution rather than death. Christianity today barely resembles Christianity of the early church. No persecution, radically different theology, entirely different relationship to political power, yet claims unbroken continuity. Maybe religions don't die. They just transform until nothing remains of the original, except the name. The study of forgotten gods isn't just history. It is a mirror held up to every contemporary belief system. It forces confrontation with an uncomfortable truth. Even the most powerful cultural institutions are temporary. Even the most eternal, seeming gods can be forgotten. Even the most absolute truths can become mythology. The mirror is uncomfortable. But maybe the lesson isn't despair about religious permanence. Maybe it is something else. Something about what gods actually are and what they teach us about human nature, culture, and the way we make meaning. Here is the question that haunts every theory about gods. If they're just human inventions, why do billions of people across all of human history, across every culture, in every time period, consistently invent them? And why do those inventions feel so real, so powerful, so necessary that people will die for them? Maybe gods are projections. But that just pushes the question back. What are we projecting, and why can't we stop? The materialist answer is straightforward. Gods are human projections, personifications of natural forces and psychological needs. They're cultural constructs serving specific social functions, maintaining moral order, explaining the inexplicable, creating community identity. When those functions get served by other means, science explains nature, secular law maintains order, national identity creates community, the gods become unnecessary. Divine death is simply functional obsolescence. We outgrow gods like we outgrow childhood fears. But the Jungian view sees something deeper. Gods are archetypes, eternal patterns in the collective unconscious appearing in different cultural forms. They don't truly die. They transform and reappear in new guises. Ra becomes solar symbolism in later religions. Odin's characteristics appear in later father-god figures. The Virgin Mother Goddess appears across cultures under different names. Gods are immortal ideas wearing temporary costumes. When one costume wears out, the archetype finds another. Nothing is actually lost. The sociological perspective following Durkheim offers different insight. Gods are symbols of society itself, representations of collective values and social cohesion. When societies change or collapse, their gods must change or die, because they were never separate from the social structure that created them. This explains why conquest and social transformation kill gods so effectively. You can't destroy a society and expect its gods to survive, because the gods were that society's self-understanding made divine. The theological view reframes the entire question. From a believing perspective, only one God is real. All others were always false, or they were real but subordinate, perhaps demons, spiritual beings, or aspects of ultimate divinity. Forgotten gods were never truly divine. Their disappearance represents truth prevailing over error. The real God remains, the false gods vanish. The pattern proves divinity's nature rather than challenging it. None of these perspectives fully resolves the mystery. Each explains aspects of divine death while leaving other aspects unexplained. The materialist can't fully account for why projections feel so universally necessary. The Jungian can't explain why specific divine forms matter intensely to believers if they're just temporary costumes. The sociologist struggles with religions that survive their originating societies. The theologian faces the uncomfortable fact that every dead religion made identical truth claims. Perhaps the category gods is itself the problem. Ra and Odin and Christ and the Tao might be so fundamentally different that treating them as variations of one category is misleading. Maybe ancient Egyptians, Norse pagans, Christians, and Taoists meant entirely different things by their divine concepts. Comparing them assumes a commonality that doesn't actually exist. Yet something profound emerges from studying forgotten gods. Humans need the sacred category. We require something transcendent, something beyond material explanation, whether we call it gods, divinity, the absolute, or ultimate meaning. But the specific content of that category is remarkably flexible and contingent. Gods die. Divinity persists, finding new forms. What does this reveal about human nature? We're pattern, seeking, meaning, making creatures requiring narratives larger than individual life. We need frameworks that make existence meaningful, whether those frameworks involve gods, progress, history, nature, or other sacred frames. The content changes. The need remains constant. Whatever gods are, their deaths teach us something essential. Nothing human culture creates is eternal. Not institutions, not beliefs, not even the most sacred truths. Which brings us to the final question. Knowing all of this, what should we do? How should we relate to the religions we have, knowing they might someday be as forgotten as the gods we've explored? The last priest who believed in Ra died roughly 1600 years ago. At the end, did he know he was the last? Did he realize that after his death, no one would ever again pray to the god who had ruled Egypt for 3,000 years? Or did he assume, like every believer before him, that the faith would continue, that someone would carry on the tradition, that the gods were eternal? We can't know, but we can know this. He was wrong, and someday someone will pray the last prayer to every god that is currently worshipped. The only question is whether anyone will notice, whether anyone will notice, whether anyone will remember, whether anyone will care. Here is what we've learned. Civilizations rise and fall. Cultural traditions are fragile. Even the most powerful religious systems can be completely forgotten, and humanity continues searching for meaning regardless. Several responses emerge from these lessons. Preservation becomes a moral imperative. Once cultural knowledge is lost, it is irretrievable. Supporting museums, archaeology, translation projects, and cultural education means protecting something for future generations. Every documented temple, every translated text, every preserved tradition is a small victory against oblivion. We owe this effort to those who came before and those who come after. Humility follows naturally. Recognizing that our current beliefs and institutions might be temporary should make us less dogmatic, more willing to learn from other traditions. more careful about imposing our views. History suggests confidence in permanence is usually unfounded. The civilizations that seemed most eternal collapsed most spectacularly. Perhaps our certainty deserves questioning. Appreciation replaces dismissal. Ancient religions represented sophisticated attempts to understand existence. They weren't primitive errors. They were complex systems of meaning developed by people as intelligent as us, addressing the same fundamental questions we still face. We should mine them for insight rather than condescension. Urgency shapes our choices. Cultural forms are fragile. What do we want future generations to remember about us? What are we doing to ensure that transmission happens? The question isn't academic, it is immediate. The paradox is real. Awareness that religions might die can either strengthen faith, motivating deeper commitment, or weaken it if impermanence implies error. Perhaps the lesson is neither. Perhaps it is learning to hold beliefs seriously while acknowledging their contingency, to commit while remaining aware of uncertainty, to believe without claiming absolute permanence. Individuals still need meaning, community, and frameworks for understanding existence. Whether through traditional religion, secular philosophy, spiritual practice, or other forms, the search that created ancient gods continues in modern forms. Some find meaning in the search itself, in questions rather than answers. In the continuity of humans seeking across millennia, there is genuine tragedy in forgotten gods. Silenced prayers, destroyed temples. These represented millions of people's deepest convictions and experiences, now reduced to archaeology and academic speculation. We should feel that loss rather than dismissing it. But there is also wonder, humanity's resilience, our persistent creation of new forms of meaning, our refusal to accept that existence is meaningless even when old meanings fail. In the end, the silence of ancient gods might teach us less about the gods and more about ourselves, about our need for the sacred, our capacity for change, our creativity in meaning making, our mortality, both individual and collective. The gods may be forgotten, but the questions that created them, why are we here? How should we live? What endures? Echo still, unanswered but persistent, waiting for each generation to struggle with them anew. Perhaps that struggle is what makes us human. Maybe what matters most isn't whether the gods survive, but whether we remember them, honor what they meant to people who came before us, and hold gently the truths we believe, knowing they, too, might someday be forgotten.